The first thing he felt was a drop, warm and sticky. It fell on his face and smelled of rot and iron at the same time. Daniel tried to raise his hand to wipe it off. His arm wouldn't move. Instead, something small and membranous twitched upward, greenish yellow, the size of a fingernail. He stared at the thing and realized it was his paw, his own paw. A leaf the size of a sailboat hung over his head. A centipede as long as a bus was crawling across it. Daniel opened his mouth to scream. A short, wet croak came out of his throat. He looked down into a puddle on the leaf and saw his reflection, a small, bright yellow frog with black streaks, 4 centimeters long. Wet, defenseless, very much alive. He was a toxicologist, a leading expert on natural poisons, 10 years of working with batrachotoxins and conotoxins. He knew the Dendrobatidae family by heart, and now he himself was one of them, a poisonous tree frog with alkaloids in its skin, a creature that must not be touched with bare hands, a creature that must not be eaten, a creature that theoretically shouldn't exist at this size. And yet, despite all this, he was still thinking like a scientist. That drop that fell on his face, he tasted it with his tongue. Formic acid mixed with histamine. He identified the poison by taste, just with his tongue, without a mass spectrometer, without a chromatograph, without 3 days of lab work, in 2 seconds. And then a warm wave ran down his spine, where his spine now was. A quiet text unfolded in his head. Primary sample assimilated, formic acid, 4%. Adaptation initiated. Estimated time, 6 hours. Daniel sat on a leaf in the middle of a swamp teeming with creatures, any one of which could have swallowed him whole without even noticing. And for the first time in 10 years, he smiled genuinely. Not with his mouth, because a frog's mouth doesn't work that way, but with something inside. For the first 6 hours, he didn't move. Adaptation to formic acid was taking place throughout his entire body. His skin was covered with tiny blisters. His muscles twitched on their own. It was painful, but bearable, like a mild burn spread across his entire surface. Yes, Neil lay on the edge of the leaf and counted. He counted everything. The leaf was about 2 meters in diameter. The height above the ground was 5 meters. The humidity was about 90%. The temperature was 30 degrees. The tropics, or something very similar. The sounds around him were deafening. Chirping, buzzing, gurgling, the distant roar of something massive. And the smells, dozens of smells he wouldn't have been able to distinguish before. Rotting wood, fungal spores, the secretion of some insect with a sour note. And something else, sweetish and unpleasant. Something that made him want to crawl as far away as possible. He crawled away. After 3 hours of acclimating, he tried to move. The jump came out crooked. His front legs splayed apart and he plopped his snout into the water. He tried again. This time it was better. 20 centimeters. For a frog his size, that was normal. For a former human standing 1 meter 80 tall, it was humiliating. He hopped from one end of the leaf to the other again and again. He was training his coordination. On Earth, he knew that tree climbers were excellent jumpers. Now he was about to become one of them. By the end of the 6th hour, the adaptation was complete. A new thought formed in his mind. Formic acid assimilation complete. Available concentration, 2% of body mass. Method of secretion, skin glands. Daniel carefully ran his paw across the surface of the leaf. A thin, damp streak remained on the green surface. He sniffed it. Formic acid. Weak but real. His body had produced the poison. His own body. He looked around. A small spider lived on the neighboring leaves. Tiny, smaller than him. Every hour an ant patrol passed by. 3 or 4 large ants with mandibles capable of bite his leg. They would grab the spider, paralyze it with their secretion, then they'd let it go and move on, as if they were patrolling the territory. The spider would come to every 10 minutes or so. It sat motionless, waiting for the next patrol. Daniel watched this unfold for 2 full cycles and figured out the pattern. The ants followed the same route every time. The secretion they used to paralyze the spider was released from their mandibles. Judging by the spider's reaction, it was a fast-acting neurotoxin. Reversible, weak, designed for small prey. Daniel made up his mind. He crawled to the edge of the leaf, lay on his back, exposed his soft belly, and waited. When the ant arrived, it didn't hesitate. Its mandibles clamped down on Daniel's front leg. The pain was so intense that he lost consciousness instantly, not a second later, not half a second later. Immediately, darkness, then a slow return to consciousness. His whole body was on fire. His leg had swollen to twice its size. He couldn't move it, but the text was already forming in his mind. Secondary sample detected. Paralytic neurotoxin, sodium channel blocker class, concentration in the sample 11%. Adaptation initiated, estimated time 4 hours. For 4 hours, he lay on the sheet, unable to move. His paw gradually returned to normal. His body was doing its job. It was restructuring his glands. It was learning to produce a new toxin. And Daniel lay there and thought. He thought that on Earth, conducting such an experiment on himself would have cost him his license. He thought that the dose determines the poison and that this rule applies in any world. He thought that if his body could absorb toxins through poisoning, then he had a plan, not a quick one, not a safe one, but a plan. When the adaptation was complete, he crawled to the edge of the leaf. The next ant patrol appeared 20 minutes later. 3 ants. The first headed toward the spider. Daniel leaped. He landed right on the ant's back and touched it with his leg. One touch. The ant twitched. Fell onto its side, froze. Daniel rolled off it and crawled away. The ant didn't move. A minute later, Daniel crawled closer and touched it with his tongue. Dead. The dose that was safe for the ant from the outside turned out to be lethal from the inside. The other 2 ants stopped. They touched the dead one with their antennae. They turned away. They left. The spider on the neighboring leaf sat motionless. For the first time during the entire observation, no patrol approached it. Daniel sat on the leaf, wet and shivering. His first patient. A spider he couldn't ask if it needed help, but whom he helped simply because he could. Night fell over the swamp like a wet blanket. The sounds changed. The daytime chirping gave way to a thick, low hum. Something large was moving below in the water. Something even larger was flying above among the treetops. Daniel burrowed into a fold of the leaf and curled up. His skin secreted a weak toxin. Any creature that tried to taste him would be in for an unpleasant surprise. But that wouldn't save him from those who swallow without tasting. He didn't sleep all night. He listened. He counted. He memorized. By morning, he knew that a large predator passed beneath his tree every 3 hours, that small flying insects avoided his leaf because of the smell of acid, that somewhere to the west there was a water source because a fresh scent wafted from that direction. The morning of the second day began with hunger. Daniel realized he hadn't eaten anything in over a day. Tree climbers fed on small insects, ants, termites, and mites. The irony was that he had just killed an ant with his venom. He found the dead body. It had already begun to decompose in the warm air. Daniel swallowed it whole. The taste was disgusting, but his stomach accepted it. His energy returned within an hour, just enough to think clearly. By the second day, he had mastered jumps of up to 30 centimeters. He learned to cling to vertical stems. He found a source of water, a small stream trickling down the tree's bark toward the roots. The water was clean, no toxins, no impurities. He drank long and thirstily. On the third day, he climbed down from the tree. It took 4 hours. Every ledge, every crack in the bark, every wet spot was a potential death trap. Once, he slipped and fell 1/2 meter. For a human, that's nothing. For a 4-centimeter-long frog, it's like falling from a 5-story building. He hit a root ledge. Something cracked in his hind leg. The pain was intense and sharp. He lay by the tree's roots for about 20 minutes before he could move. His leg still worked, but poorly. His leap had become shorter. The swamp at ground level was a different world. Everything here was wet and dark. Light filtered through the tree canopy in patches. Each patch was teeming with life. Beetles the size of a fist. Worms as thick as an arm. Mushrooms twice his height. And the smells. Down below, there were 10 times as many smells. Every rock, every root, every puddle smelled different, and most of these smells pointed to one thing: poison. Poison everywhere. In the mushrooms, in the slime on the rocks, in the water of stagnant puddles, in the air above certain flowers. This place was a gigantic laboratory, an open, free, endless laboratory full of samples he could absorb. Daniel sat by the roots of a tree and gazed at this poisonous splendor. And for the first time since his transfer, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about possibilities. On the 4th day, he found a wasp. She was building a nest under a nearby root, a large one, about the size of a finger. Its stinger was almost as long as he was. He watched it for 2 hours. The wasp hunted small caterpillars. It paralyzed them with its stinger and dragged them back to the nest. The stinger secreted a substance. Daniel crawled closer and sniffed the residue on a paralyzed caterpillar. Histamine, a high concentration. Plus something else, some kind of peptide he didn't recognize. On Earth, he would have sent a sample for analysis. Here, he had only his tongue. He licked the caterpillar. The information unfolded instantly. Histamine, 18%. Melittin-like peptide, 31%. Phospholipase, 2%. The structure resembled the venom of Earth's wasps of the Vespidae family, but with a modification. The peptide was longer, more aggressive. It destroyed cell membranes faster than any earthly counterpart. Daniel decided not to rush things. His leg still hurt. His body hadn't fully recovered from the ant bite. It would be dangerous to absorb a second serious toxin right now. He waited another day. He fed on dead insects. He practiced jumping. He explored the surroundings. On the 5th day, he was ready. The wasp returned to its nest with its prey. Daniel leaped out from behind a tree root and landed right in front of her. The wasp reacted instantly. Its stinger pierced his side. The world turned into a white flash of pain, then into darkness. He came to 8 hours later. His side was swollen. The skin around the sting had darkened and formed a scab. Every breath sent a jolt of pain through his ribs. But the text in his head was already at work. Secondary sample assimilated. Histamine complex with a melittin-like peptide. Adaptation complete. Available concentration 1.5%. Method of secretion: skin glands and saliva. Daniel lay at the base of the tree, breathing heavily. 2 venoms in 5 days. Formic acid and wasp venom on Earth. A discovery like this would have earned him a 10-year grant. Here, he paid for it with pain so intense it made him lose consciousness. But he was alive, and he could produce 2 different venoms with his own body, and most importantly, he already knew how to mix them. Formic acid breaks down the outer defenses of cells. The wasp peptide penetrates inside through the damaged membrane. Separately, both poisons were weak. Together, they became something completely new, something that had never been seen in this swamp before. Daniel was a toxicologist, and the swamp had just become his laboratory. On the 6th day, Daniel encountered for the first time something that could devour him without a second thought. A snake, long, dark green with yellow rings along its spine. As thick as his body and 1.5 meters long, it slithered along the roots slowly and confidently. Its tongue flickered through the air, sampling scents. Daniel froze. His bright yellow skin was a warning to those who understood. Aposematic coloration, a signal to predators that the prey is poisonous. On Earth, it worked. Most predators had learned to give the tree climber a wide berth. But here, he didn't know the rules. Maybe the local snakes didn't care about the warning coloration. Maybe they were immune to his venom. Maybe they were just too hungry to think. The snake turned its head toward him. Its tongue flickered twice. It had caught his scent. Daniel leapt, not toward the snake, but in the opposite direction, as far as he could. 30 centimeters. He landed on a wet rock. He pushed off again. Another 30. The snake moved after him. She was faster, much faster. Daniel jumped from root to root. The snake slithered after him, cutting corners. The distance was shrinking. 10 jumps, 8, 5. He could feel the vibration of its body through the wet bark. 3 jumps, 2. The snake struck. Its jaws snapped open. Its fangs flashed. Daniel fell into a crevice between the roots. A narrow one. Too narrow for the snake's head. Its snout slammed into the tree with a dull thud. The snake hissed. It began coiling around the root, trying to squeeze through. Daniel sat in the crevice, breathing heavily. His heart was pounding at a rate he couldn't count. The snake fumbled around outside for about 10 minutes, then it slithered away. Daniel stayed in the crevice for another hour just to be on the safe side. When he finally crawled out, the first thing he did was return to the spot where the snake had found him. He found a wet mark on the bark left by its body. He licked it. The information came instantly. The scales contained traces of 4 different substances. He recognized 3 of them. A postsynaptic protein neurotoxin, similar to the alpha bungarotoxin of the cobra. A hemotoxin that destroys blood vessel walls, similar to the venom of vipers of the Viperidae family. A cytotoxin that causes tissue necrosis, similar to the venom of some aspids. He didn't recognize the 4th one. The structure was unfamiliar, something that didn't exist on Earth. Something was specific to this world. Daniel memorized all 4. Someday he would return to this snake. But not today. Today he was too small and too weak. On the 7th day he found a spider. Not the little spider on the leaf that he had saved from the ants. Another one. A large one. As big as a plate. Brown with red dots on its back. The spider sat in the center of a web stretched between 2 roots. The web glistened in patches of light. 3 dried-up insects hung from it. Daniel studied the spider for half a day. The spider didn't move. Only when prey got caught in the web, it would dart from the center to the edge so quickly that the eye couldn't follow. Its fangs sank in. The prey froze. A minute later, the spider would drag it back to the center and begin to wrap it in silk. The spider's venom worked differently than that of ants or wasps. It didn't kill. It paralyzed the prey completely, and for a long time, the prey remained alive, but motionless. The spider ate it afterward, slowly, sometimes over the course of days. Daniel wanted that venom. A long-acting paralytic would be a huge advantage, not for hunting, for defense. If he could paralyze an attacker for hours rather than minutes, that would change everything. But the spider was 15 times his size. Its fangs were half as long as Daniel's body. A single bite meant death, not assimilation. Death. Too high a dose, too small a body. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. On the 9th day, he found a solution. The spider left traces of venom on its web. Not pure venom, but its residues, diluted with saliva and digestive enzymes. The concentration was dozens of times lower than in a direct bite. Daniel crawled to the edge of the web. He found a thread from which a dried-up insect hung. He licked the thread. Analysis showed the venom concentration was 3% of what the spider injected with its fangs. 3%. Enough to feel the effects, not enough to die. Theoretically, Daniel pressed his skin against the thread. The venom seeped in through his skin, slowly, drop by drop. Nothing happened for the first 10 minutes. Then his hind legs went numb. Then his front legs. Then he lost feeling in the tail end of his spine. The paralysis crept up from the bottom like water in a glass. Daniel didn't panic. He kept track. He calculated the rate of spread. He calculated his remaining sensitivity. He calculated the time until complete paralysis. When the numbness reached his throat, he stopped breathing. Not because his lungs had failed, because his intercostal muscles could no longer contract. He lay on the edge of the web, completely paralyzed and slowly suffocated. The spider sensed a vibration at the edge of the web. It turned. It began moving toward him. Daniel couldn't move. He couldn't jump. He couldn't even blink. The spider was getting closer. Daniel was dying. The text in his head processed the information unflappably. Tertiary sample detected. Long-acting paralytic neurotoxin. Class: neuromuscular transmission blockers. Adaptation initiated. Estimated duration: 2 hours. 2 hours. The spider was 30 centimeters away. In a minute, it would be 10. In 2 minutes, it would touch him. And then the formic acid kicked in. Daniel didn't control it. His body reacted on its own. His skin secreted everything it could. Formic acid and wasp peptide simultaneously. At maximum concentration, the spider touched him with its front leg. His leg twitched. The spider took a step back. It touched him with another leg. That one twitched too. The spider froze. Then it slowly turned around and went back to the center of the web. Prey that stung wasn't worth its attention. Daniel lay paralyzed for another hour and a half. He began to breathe after 40 minutes. When the paralysis lifted from his chest muscles, air rushed into his lungs with a wheeze. He lay there and breathed. He just breathed. It was the best feeling of his life, in both of his lives. 2 hours later, the adaptation was complete. He could move. He could breathe, and he had 3 poisons: formic acid, wasp peptide, and spider paralytic. 3 tools in a body that weighed less than 10 grams. On the 10th day, he began to experiment. Formic acid plus the paralyzing agent. The result was interesting. The acid destroyed the protective cuticle layer of insects. The paralyzing agent penetrated through the destroyed barrier 10 times faster. The time to complete paralysis was reduced from 1 minute to 6 seconds. Wasp peptide plus the paralyzing agent. Even more interesting, the peptide destroyed the cell membranes of the nerve endings. The paralyzing agent entered the exposed nerves directly. The effect was almost instantaneous and irreversible. All 3 together. Daniel tested it on a dead beetle, just to see how the tissues reacted. The tissue dissolved at the point of contact within 30 seconds. This wasn't medicine. It was a weapon. Daniel sat on a tree stump and stared at the dissolved patch. He didn't want a weapon. He wanted tools. But in a swamp where every creature wanted to eat him, the difference between a tool and a weapon was a matter of dosage. The dose makes the poison. On the 11th day, he went down to the water. Real water. Not a trickle on the bark, but a dark, quiet stream between the roots. The water smelled of earth and iron and something else. That same slightly sweet smell that had made him crawl away on the first day. He licked the water. The analysis took a long time. The water contained 23 different chemical compounds. He identified most of them. Iron salts, organic acids, amino acids, fungal spores, metabolic waste products from large organisms. But one compound was different, complex, multi-component, with a molecular structure he couldn't fully decipher. The system returned a partial analysis. Unknown compound. A biological agent with neurotropic activity, partial overlap with serotonin agonists, mechanism of action undetermined. A complete sample is required. Daniel pulled his tongue away from the water. A neurotropic agent in an open body of water, something that affected the brain, something that was dissolved in the water drunk by all the swamp's inhabitants. He didn't know yet that it was the 7th Arot. He didn't know yet that this thing was destroying villages and erasing people's memories. He simply memorized the structure and moved on. By the end of the 2nd week, Daniel was a different creature, not physically. Physically, he was still a 4-centimeter-long frog, but inside he was a toxicologist with 3 tools at his disposal and a rudimentary understanding of the local biochemistry. He knew the water was dangerous. He knew that snakes used at least 4 types of venom. He knew that even the smallest insects here were more toxic than their Earth counterparts, by order of magnitude more toxic than their Earth counterparts. And he knew the most important thing: this place was not a trap. This place was a library. Every creature, every mushroom, every drop of water contained information. And his body was the perfect instrument for reading that information. He just needed to survive long enough to read it all. In the 3rd week, Daniel began to grow. Not quickly, not like in fairy tales, where the hero wakes up in a new body. Just 1 millimeter a day. But he noticed the difference when his usual leap became 5 centimeters longer. And when a beetle he previously couldn't swallow whole suddenly fit into his mouth, his growth was linked to the absorption of poisons. Each new toxin restructured his body. It added glands, it thickened his skin, it strengthened his muscles. The system didn't tell him this directly, he figured it out himself. By correlation, 3 poisons, 3 millimeters of growth in 2 weeks. If the pattern held true, then to grow to a size where a random bird couldn't swallow him, he'd need at least 15 more toxins. At his current rate of absorption, that would take 4 months, if he survived that long. On the 16th day, he found some lion, bright orange. It covered a rock by the water like a smooth carpet. The air around the rock smelled sour and bitter at the same time. Dead insects lay on the ground all around it. Dozens, hundreds, tiny flies and large beetles, all dead, all within a half-meter radius of the rock. Daniel approached cautiously. The lichen was releasing volatile toxins, gaseous ones. This was new. Until now, all its poisons had worked through contact, liquid on the skin, injection through a bite, dissolution in mucus. But gas was on another level. The gas spread through the air. Gas didn't require contact. Gas could blanket an area. He crawled to a safe distance and stuck his tongue out into the air. The analysis came back weak. The toxin concentration in the air was low. Each individual molecule was familiar. It resembled cyanogenic glycosides, substances that, when broken down, release hydrocyanic acid. On Earth, these were found in almonds and cherry pits. Only here, the concentration was hundreds of times higher. Absorbing a gaseous toxin was more difficult than a liquid one. Daniel couldn't just lick the gas. He had to inhale it, let it pass through his lungs, allow the poison to be absorbed through the pulmonary epithelium. He thought about it for a day. Then he came up with a plan. He found a large leaf. He rolled it into a tube. He pointed one end toward the lichen. He pressed the other end to his face, a makeshift respirator in reverse, a gas concentrator. The first breath yielded nothing, neither did the second. On the third breath, he tasted bitter almonds in his throat, hydrocyanic acid, and immediately his head spun, his vision blurred, his legs gave out. He fell onto his side and stopped breathing, not because his muscles had failed, because his cells had stopped absorbing oxygen. Cyanide was blocking cytochrome oxidase. Cellular respiration had stopped. He was dying at the molecular level. Every cell in his body was suffocating in the midst of air full of oxygen. Darkness came quickly. A text flashed through his mind and vanished. He came to after an unknown amount of time, maybe an hour, maybe 3. His whole body ached, not just certain parts, but everything, every cell, every fiber, as if his body had been broken apart and put back together again. And perhaps that was exactly what had happened. The text appeared, slowly. 4th sample, assimilated cyanogenic glycoside complex. Adaptation complete. Available concentration, critically low, 0.3%. Method of release, exhalation, exhalation. He could exhale poison. Daniel lay on the ground, processing this information. The concentration was minuscule. It would be impossible to kill a large creature with this exhalation, but he could stun small insects within a radius of a few centimeters. And most importantly, this was the 4th method of delivery. Skin contact, saliva contact, injection through mucous membranes. And now, exhalation. 4 ways to poison a target. For a 4-centimeter frog, this was a remarkable arsenal. On the 18th day, he caught his first fish. A small one, about 5 centimeters long. It was swimming in a shallow backwater among the roots. Daniel jumped into the water. He touched the fish with his paw, releasing a mixture of formic acid and a paralyzing agent. The fish twitched and went still. He pulled it ashore and ate it. It was his first real meal in nearly 3 weeks. Not dried up insects, not dead ants, but real protein. His body reacted instantly. Over the next 2 days, he grew another 2 millimeters. He realized that his growth depended not only on the poisons, but also on his diet. It made sense. To build new tissue, you need building materials. The poisons gave the command to grow. Food provided the resources. On the 20th day, what he'd feared from day one happened. A bird. It appeared from above, without warning, without a sound. Just a shadow that fell on him and turned into an open beak. The beak was yellow and long. A heron, or something like a heron. Daniel didn't have time to jump. The beak grabbed him across his body, squeezed, lifted him into the air. He hung in the beak several meters above the ground and looked down at the swamp. Green, endless, beautiful, if not for the circumstances. Daniel did the only thing he could. He released everything, all 4 poisons at once, through every gland, through every pore. His skin became covered with a murky film of acid, peptides, and a paralyzing agent. He exhaled cyanide gas straight into the bird's nostrils. The bird jerked its head. Its beak opened. Daniel fell downward. The impact with the water was painful, but not fatal. He submerged. He surfaced. He hid beneath a tree root. The bird above was shaking its head, sneezing, opening and closing its beak. Then it flew away. Daniel sat under the root, trembling, not from the cold, from the realization of just how close he'd come. The beak, the stomach, the acid, darkness, the end. His poisons had saved his life, but it was luck, not strategy. If the bird had swallowed faster, he wouldn't have had time to release enough toxin. He needed to grow faster, eat more, absorb more poisons, become big enough and poisonous enough so that no creature in this swamp would see him as food. He spent the next 5 days in hunting mode. He caught fish in the backwaters. He killed small insects with his poisonous breath. He ate everything he could swallow, and he searched for new poisons. On the 23rd day, he found a poisonous mushroom, purple, with white dots on its cap, as big as his head. The mushroom's spores covered the ground around it in a thin layer. Daniel licked a spore. A mycotoxin, complex, multi-stage, affecting the liver and kidneys. A slow killer, not instant death, but gradual organ failure. On Earth, similar toxins were found in pale toadstools, amatoxins. Here, the structure was different, but the principle was the same. Inhibition of RNA polymerase, halting of protein synthesis. Cells stop regenerating, organs fail one by one. Over the course of days, not minutes, Daniel faced a choice. This poison was more dangerous than all the previous ones. The previous ones killed quickly, painfully but quickly. This one killed slowly, and there was no antidote for it. On Earth, amatoxin poisoning was treated with plasmapheresis and a liver transplant. Here, he had neither. If his body couldn't handle the toxin, he would die over the course of days. He thought about it for a full day. Then he made up his mind, not because he was brave, because he was a scientist. The slow-acting mycotoxin gave him a tool that no one else in this swamp possessed. Delayed poisoning, a poison that took effect hours or days after contact. It wasn't a melee weapon. It was a strategic tool. He ate a tiny piece of the cap, about 1/10 of a millimeter in size, the smallest possible dose, and he waited. The pain came 4 hours later, dull, deep, internal, as if something inside him had begun to dissolve. He lay beneath a tree root and groaned quietly, like a frog. The pain grew, slowly but steadily. By the end of the first day, he couldn't eat. By the end of the second, he couldn't move. On the 3rd day, he lay there waiting for death. Seriously waiting, without panic, without hope. He just lay there and thought that if his body couldn't handle it, then he had lived in this world for 26 days in this world. And in those 26 days, he'd learned more about toxicology than in 10 years on Earth. That wasn't bad. On the 4th day, the text finally appeared in his mind. Sample 5 assimilated delayed action mycotoxin. Adaptation complete. Tolerable concentration, 0.1%. Method of secretion is through saliva, 0.1. Almost nothing. A single spit wouldn't be enough to poison even a large insect, but Daniel wasn't discouraged. He didn't need a lethal dose. He needed a tool. A drop of mycotoxin in the water. In 3 days, the fish in that water would start acting strangely. In 5 days, they'll fall asleep on the surface. In a week, they'll float belly up. A remote hunt. No contact. No risk. Plant the seed and wait. By the end of the 3rd week, he had 5 poisons, 4 delivery methods. His body had grown to 5.5 centimeters. And for the first time, he noticed that some creatures had started to avoid him. Not all of them, but the small predators, spiders, large beetles, those who could sense him. They smelled his skin and walked away. He was becoming part of the food chain, not prey, a threat. A small, bright threat sitting on a root and looking at the world through eyes that saw what no one else could see. On the 28th day, Daniel met a man. Or rather, the man met him. He was sitting on a tree stump by a path. He hadn't noticed the path before because he used to walk on the ground and couldn't see beyond the nearest stump. But over the past few days, he had been climbing higher and higher, and his view had broadened. The path led through a swamp. Narrow, trodden down, branches entwined with moss hung over it. Someone walked along the path regularly, footprints in the mud, small, a child's. Daniel waited 2 days. On the 30th day she appeared. A girl, a little girl, about 13 or 14 years old, thin, wearing a patched gray dress that reached her knees, barefoot, a basket slung over her shoulder. The basket was filled with grass. She walked along the path confidently and quickly. She knew every root and every bump. Her eyes were fixed on the ground. Her hands held the basket. She passed within 2 steps of him. Then she stopped, turned around, looked straight at him. Daniel froze. The girl was looking at him. He was looking at her. 2 beings, one enormous, the other tiny. She crouched down, tilted her head, reached out her hand. Daniel reflexively secreted a layer of toxin onto his skin, not lethal, but a warning. The girl withdrew her hand, looked at her fingers, sniffed them. Her eyes widened. She said something. The words were unfamiliar. The language was unfamiliar. But the intonation was clear. Surprise, respect, and caution. She took a rag out of her basket, wrapped it around her hand, carefully slid her wrapped hand under him. Daniel didn't move. She lifted him onto her palm, which was wrapped in the cloth. She brought him up to her face. She examined him, carefully, like a scientist examining a specimen, not like a child looking at a funny little animal. She spoke again, slowly, clearly, as if she expected him to understand. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he understood that she wasn't afraid, and that she knew he was poisonous, and that she'd picked him up anyway, through the cloth. The girl set him back on the tree stump. She took a small notebook and a stub of a charcoal pencil out of her basket. She began to draw him, with quick, precise strokes. A yellow body, black smudges, tiny legs, round eyes. The drawing was good. Below the drawing, she wrote something, 2 columns. Daniel couldn't read the letters, but understood the structure. They were notes, observations, a description of the species. This girl was a naturalist. On the 31st day, she came again with a basket of herbs and something else, a small clay pot with a lid. She set the pot down next to him. She opened the lid. Inside lay tiny insects, alive, scuttling around at the bottom. She had brought him food. Daniel looked at the pot, then at the girl, then back at the pot. She said something brief, 1 word, then she pointed at the pot and at him. Daniel jumped into the pot, ate 2 insects, jumped back out. The girl smiled. She took out a notebook. She wrote it down. She came every day. Every day. She brought a pot of food. Every day. She wrote it down, what he ate, how he moved, and how big he was. She measured him with a stick and wrote down his length. On the 5th day after they met, she tried to communicate with him systematically. She asked a question. She raised her right hand. She raised her left hand. She pointed to her right hand and said 1 word. She pointed to her left hand and said another. Then she asked the question again and waited. Daniel understood. Right hand meant yes. The left hand meant no. She asked questions and gave him options to choose from. He croaked once. She raised her right hand. He croaked once again. She raised her left hand. He croaked twice. She froze. She raised her right hand. He croaked once. She wrote it down in her notebook. 1 croak meant yes. 2 croaks meant no. 3 days later, they had a system. She asked questions. He answered yes or no. She learned that he was poisonous. She learned that he ate insects and fish. She learned that he understood her words. The last part shocked her. She crouched down and stared at him in silence for a long time. Then she said something long. Her voice trembled. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was telling him that her mother had been a healer, that her mother had died, that her mother had taught her to write everything down, every plant, every creature, every recipe. The girl's name was Ari. He learned her name on the 10th day of their communication. She said it and pointed to herself. Then she pointed at him and raised her eyebrows. Daniel croaked. Once, twice, 1, 2, 1. She didn't understand. He couldn't say his name by croaking. She thought for a moment. Then she took out a notebook and wrote down some symbols. She pointed to the first one. She held up 1 finger. She pointed to the second one. She held up 2 fingers. She numbered the letters. Daniel looked at the symbols and didn't understand the local writing system, but he understood the method. He croaked a specific number of times for each letter. It took 40 minutes. She wrote down every croak. She counted. She checked against the alphabet. At the end, she looked at the resulting word and said it aloud. Daniel. She said his name and looked at him. He croaked once. Yes, she smiled widely and wrote it down in her notebook. The yellow gentleman. Name. Daniel understands speech. By the end of the 4th week of their interaction, Daniel understood about 30 words of the local language. Ari came every day and taught him. She'd point to an object and say the word. He'd memorize it. Water, grass, stone, tree, poison, medicine, hurt, good, eat, drink. She realized that he knew about poisons when he refused to eat a certain kind of beetle. He croaked twice. No. She was surprised. She sniffed the beetle. She put it back. The next day, she brought the same beetle, wrapped in leaves. She placed a note with a question next to it. She wrote a word he already knew. Poison. And she raised her eyebrows. He croaked once. Yes. She crushed the beetle on a rock. She touched the juice with her finger. She sniffed it. Her expression changed. She recognized the scent. This beetle was poisonous, and its poison was used in local medicine. She hadn't known it was poisonous until Daniel showed her. From that day on, she began bringing him samples, a new one every day, grass, a root, a mushroom, a beetle, lichen. She would place the sample in front of him. He would touch it with his tongue. He would croak once if it was safe, twice if it was poisonous, and she wrote it down. Page after page. The notebook filled up. Daniel became her tool, her instrument. A living poison detector sitting in a clay pot, and she became his hands, his voice, his connection to the world in which he was too small to exist on his own. By the middle of the 2nd month, Daniel had grown to 6 centimeters. That was small for a human, but for a tree frog, it was a lot. Larger than any member of the Dendrobatidae family on Earth, and more toxic. By this point, he had absorbed 7 toxins. Formic acid, wasp peptide, spider paralytic toxin, cyanogenic gas, fungal mycotoxin, the hemolytic toxin from a leech, which he extracted in the 5th week from a dead leech found in a drying puddle, and scorpion neurotoxin, which he obtained when Ari brought him the tail of a dead scorpion wrapped in a rag. The scorpion venom cost him 2 days of fever and nearly killed him. Daniel lay in a pot at Ari's house, his body shaking with convulsions. Ari sat beside him and changed his water every hour. She hadn't slept for 2 nights. When he came to, she was pale and had dark circles under her eyes. She said one word that he already knew, more, and she shook her head. "Don't do that again," he croaked once. Yes. And he knew he was lying. He would do it again and again, because every new poison made him stronger. Ari's house stood on the edge of the village of wet willows. A small hut with a thatched roof, 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a bedroom. In the kitchen A table piled high with bundles of herbs, shelves lined with pots, a mortar and pestle made of dark stone, the smell of dried roots and smoke. In the bedroom, 2 sleeping platforms, one for Ari, the other for her younger brother. The boy was about 7 years old, quiet, skinny, with big eyes. He was afraid of Daniel for the first 3 days. Then he got used to him. Then he started catching flies for him. The village of Mokrieefov was situated on the border between the swamp and relatively dry land. 20 houses, maybe 30. The people lived by fishing and gathering herbs. They sold the herbs to merchants who came once a month. With the money they earned, they bought grain and salt and medicine. Medicines were their biggest expense. Every morning, every villager drank a dose of what was called morning water, a small vial of murky liquid, an antidote to the swamp's background toxins. Without morning water, a cough would set in after a few days. After a week, the cough would turn into suffocation. After 2, the person would die, lungs full of pink foam. The morning water was supplied by the House of So, the province's largest pharmacy clan, a monopoly, the sole supplier. The price of a single vial equaled a fisherman's daily wages. The village paid half its income for the right to breathe. Ari told him this, not with words, but by demonstrating. She brought a vial of morning water. She showed it to him. Then she showed him a coin. Then she showed him an empty bowl. A choice between medicine and food. Daniel understood. He asked her to open the vial. He licked the contents. The analysis came instantly, and he nearly fell off the shelf. Morning water was a very simple formula. 3 components. Tannin from the bark of a local tree. It acted as an absorbent, binding toxins in the intestines. An extract from some kind of root. It acted as an antihistamine, reducing swelling in the airways. Salt. Ordinary salt. It maintained the water-salt balance. 3 ingredients. All 3 grew within a kilometer of the village. The production cost of a single bottle was close to 0. The So family sold the water for a day's wages. The profit margin wasn't 100%, not 1,000. Infinity. They sold something that was free in exchange for everything people had. Daniel sat on the shelf and looked at the vial, and for the first time in this world, he felt not scientific curiosity, but anger. Not abstract anger, concrete anger, directed anger. He croaked. He caught Ari's attention. She came over. He hopped onto the table. He walked over to a bundle of bark lying among her herbs. He touched it with his paw. He croaked. He walked over to the root on the neighboring shelf. He touched it. He croaked. He hopped over to the little bag of salt. He touched it. He croaked. Then he looked at the vial of morning water. He croaked. Ari looked at him, then at the bark, at the root, at the salt, back at the vial. Her eyes widened. She understood. She grabbed a notebook and began to write. Daniel dictated the proportions with his croaks. It took an hour. They double-checked the measurements 3 times. Ari ground the bark in a mortar. She chopped the root. She added salt. She poured in hot water. She strained it through a cloth. The liquid turned out cloudy, almost exactly like the morning water from the House of So's flask. Ari looked at the result. She looked at Daniel. Her hands were shaking. She hesitated to drink it. Daniel jumped into the bowl of the concoction. All of him, entirely. He sat in it, licked it, showed her it was safe. Ari laughed. For the first time since they'd met, she scooped some out of the bowl with a spoon, drank it, set the bowl on the table, sat down, waited. An hour passed, and nothing happened. 2 hours passed, and still nothing. The next morning, she didn't drink the bottle from the House of So. Instead, she drank her own concoction. And by evening, she was alive and well. On the 3rd day, she gave the concoction to her brother. On the 4th, she brought some to her elderly neighbor who had run out of money for her morning water and had already started coughing. The old woman drank it. Her cough was gone by evening. On the 5th day, 3 women from the village came to Ari's house. On the 6th, everyone came. Ari was brewing the decoction in a large pot in the backyard. Daniel sat on a shelf in the kitchen and listened to the voices behind the wall. 23 families. Everyone came. Everyone tried it. Everyone was alive. The cost of one cauldron of decoction was 0. The bark grew on the trees, the root grew in the ground. Salt was in every home. In 1 week, the village of Wet Willows stopped paying the House of So for morning water. Daniel didn't think about the consequences. He thought like a scientist, not a politician. He saw a problem. He solved it. He moved on to the next one. The next problem presented itself. On the 8th day after the free decoction began, a disease struck the village. Not just background poisoning from the swamp. A real disease. 3 children fell ill with high fevers. Their throats swelled up. Red spots appeared on their skin. Their breathing became wheezy and labored. The local equivalent of diphtheria. Ari ran to him with tears in her eyes. She brought a rag with phlegm from one of the children. Daniel licked it. The analysis took 10 seconds. A bacterial toxin, protein-based. It blocks protein synthesis in the epithelial cells of the respiratory tract, similar to diphtheria, toxin, but stronger. Twice the affinity for receptors, 3 times faster penetration into the cell. On Earth, diphtheria was treated with anti-toxin serum. Here, there was neither serum nor a laboratory to produce it, but Daniel had something else. His body, he could absorb this toxin, fight it off, and produce not a poison, but its opposite, an antidote. Because he knew that on Earth, the diphtheria toxin is neutralized by a protein that binds to the same receptor but without the toxic effect. Competitive inhibition, classic pharmacology. He dove into the phlegm. He licked the rag until his tongue went numb. The toxin was absorbed through the mucous membrane. The pain set in an hour later. His throat swelled up, breathing became difficult, his skin broke out in red spots. The same symptoms as in children, only in a body that weighed 20 grams, not 20 kilograms. He was dying. For real. Ari held him in her palms, wrapped in cloth. He could feel the warmth of her hands through the fabric, and he thought, not about death, about the mechanism, about how the toxin binds to the receptor, about which protein could block that binding, about how his body, if it survived, would produce that very protein, because that's how adaptation works. It doesn't just process the poison, it creates an antidote. 2 in 1. He survived the night, barely. In the morning, the text appeared in his mind. Faint and disjointed. Sample assimilated. Bacterial protein toxin. Adaptation complete. 2 synthesis options available. First, toxin, concentration 0.2%. Second, antitoxin, concentration 0.4%. Method of extraction, saliva and mucus. Antitoxin. His body had produced the antidote. Daniel slid off Ari's palm onto the table. He walked over to the bowl of water. He lowered his head and let his saliva drip into the water. A drop. A small one, almost invisible, but containing a protein that could neutralize the toxin. He croaked and looked at Ari. She understood. She added his drop to a decoction made from local bark. She stirred it. She took it to the sick child. The child drank it. 2 hours later, the fever began to subside. After 4 hours, the spots faded. After 6 hours, the child asked for food. Ari returned to him. Her hands were shaking. She sat down on the floor next to the ledge where he was sitting, and she cried, quietly, without a sound. Tears simply streamed down her cheeks. She said a word he already knew, a mom, and another one he'd just learned from the intonation and context. Same, mom, too. Her mother had died of an illness that could have been cured if only there had been someone nearby who knew how. Daniel sat on the shelf and silently watched the crying girl. He wanted to tell her something important, that he was here, that now he was here, and he knew how. But all that came out of his throat was a short, quiet croak. Over the next 3 days, all 3 children recovered. 20 had fallen ill. 18 survived. 2 died before Ari could bring the medicine. 2 out of 20. Before, all 20 would have died. The village of Wet Willows looked at the little herbalist and at the yellow frog in the pot with different eyes, not with gratitude, with something greater, with hope. The village elder came to Ari. He sat down on the threshold of her house. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked who it was. Ari replied, "This is the Yellow Lord. He knows poisons. He knows medicines. He is not human, but he heals people." The elder looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the elder. The old man bowed to the little yellow frog in the pot. He bowed all the way to the ground. Daniel croaked once quietly, and he thought that on Earth he would have been jailed for conducting unauthorized clinical trials on children. But here they bowed to him. The world was strange. Both worlds were strange. But at least in this one, his work mattered. Rumors spread beyond the village in the third week after the epidemic. Daniel knew this would happen. Merchants came once a month. They noticed that the village wasn't buying morning water. They asked why. They were told. The merchants left and told other merchants. Those told the next ones. Within a month, the 3 nearest settlements knew about wet willows. Within 2 months, the entire border region knew. A village that doesn't pay the house of So, a village that brews its own morning water, a village where a yellow frog that can heal lives. Daniel waited for the house of So's reaction. It came in the 4th month of his life in this world. 2 men, in dark cloaks with high collars, with a coat of arms on their sleeves, a white flower on a black field, the coat of arms of House So. They entered the village in the morning and went straight to the elder's house. Daniel sat in a pot on Aries' shelf and watched through the window. The men spoke with the elder for a long time. Their voices were calm, polite. By this point, Daniel already understood about 200 words of the local language and could make out simple phrases. The men were talking about order, about an agreement, about how the village was obligated to buy its morning water from the house of So because that's how it had always been, because that is the law, because the house of So is responsible for the residents' health. And if anyone dies from a homemade concoction, it will be the village, not the house of So, that is to blame. The elder listened and nodded. Then he said that no one had died, that the concoction works, that the children who had been sick are now healthy. The men exchanged glances. One of them asked about the frog. The elder fell silent. The men left by evening. They didn't make any threats. They didn't break anything. They just left. That was worse than threats. Daniel knew how monopolies worked. He'd worked at a pharmaceutical company for 10 years. He'd seen how competitors were destroyed, not with fists, but with paperwork, laws, prices, pressure on suppliers, quiet strangulation. The house of So wouldn't attack the village. They would simply stop selling it. Everything else. Salt, grain, cloth, tools, everything the village didn't produce itself. A blockade, economic, pure, legal. He turned out to be right. 2 weeks later, the merchants stopped coming. All of them. At once, the village was left without grain a month before the new fish harvest. Without salt, without iron to repair the boats, without cloth for clothing. Ari came to him that evening. She sat down by the shelf. She didn't cry. She spoke calmly and quietly. Daniel didn't understand every word, but he got the gist. The village was starving. They had 3 weeks' worth of supplies. Then the children would start dying. He sat in his little pot and thought. He could cure diseases. He could identify poisons. He could brew antidotes, but he couldn't create food out of nothing. He couldn't force the merchants to return. He couldn't lift the blockade. He was a toxicologist, not an economist. And then he remembered something, the leech. That very same dead leech from which he had extracted the hemolytic agent. It lay in a drying puddle, but mushrooms were growing around the puddle, edible ones. He'd seen small rodents eat them and survive. And next to the mushrooms grew moss where larvae lived. Fatty, protein-rich, the very ones local fishermen used as a bait. The swamp fed those who knew where to look. The problem was that people were afraid to venture deeper into the swamp beyond the trail. Too many poisonous creatures, too many toxic plants. One wrong step and you'd step on a root that would make your skin peel off within an hour. One sip of the wrong water, and by morning you'd be a corpse. But now the village had a detector, a living poison detector, a 4-centimeter-long specialist with a tongue that could analyze any substance in 2 seconds. Daniel croaked. He caught Ari's attention. He jumped onto the table. He pointed with his paw toward the door, towards the swamp outside the window. He croaked once. Ari understood. The next morning, she went out to the swamp with Daniel in a pot strapped to her belt. 2 men from the village went with her, fishermen, strong, silent, wary. They looked at the frog in the pot with distrust they did little to hide. Daniel worked all day. Ari placed the pot next to each plant. He poked his head out, licked, croaked, once for safety, twice to signal danger. They covered 100 meters that day, 100 meters deep into the swamp, and found 3 species of edible mushrooms, 2 species of edible roots, edible larvae, and a clean water source. In a single day, Daniel tripled the village's foraging territory. On the second day, 6 of them went. On the third, 10. Ari walked ahead with the little pot. Daniel checked every meter of the path, every plant, every puddle, every rock. Within a week, the village had claimed a new territory the size of the village itself. There was plenty of food, more than enough. The blockade of the House of So had failed. They'd been counting on famine, but famine didn't come. Something else did, though. Kim Hana appeared in the village at the end of the 4th month. Tall, thin, with long hair pulled back into a ponytail, wearing a leather jacket with a hood, 3 knives of varying lengths on her belt, a bundle of empty flasks on her back. She came on foot, alone, from the city. A 2-day journey through the swamp. She was looking for a frog, not for herself, for her father. Her father was a hunter of venomous creatures, the best in the province. 10 years ago, he went into the deep swamp to hunt for the scales of a rare snake. The snake bit him. The venom damaged his spinal cord. Since then, her father had been lying on a mat in the house and could move only his head. His arms didn't work. His legs didn't work. He could speak and he could eat. Nothing else. Hana had been feeding him for 10 years. She hunted. She sold her catch. She bought medicines that didn't help. She bought them from the House of So, from other apothecaries, from traditional healers, from quacks. Nothing worked. Then she heard about the yellow frog from Wet Willows, a frog that knew more about poisons than any apothecary. She came and said she needed help. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry, but the knuckles on her hands had turned white. Ari led her to the shelf. Hana looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Hana. She said that if this was a joke, she'd turn around and leave and never trust people again. Daniel croaked once. Hana took a rag out of her bag. She unfolded it. Inside lay a bandage soaked in something dark from her father's wound, a 10-year-old wound that still hadn't healed. It was festering, oozing, slowly devouring the surrounding tissue. Daniel licked the bandage. The analysis was complex, multi-layered. The snake venom had seeped into the tissue and continued to act for 10 years. A neurotoxin that had damaged the myelin sheath of the nerves. Without myelin, nerve impulses could not travel from the brain to the limbs. His arms and legs were intact. His muscles were atrophied but alive. His nerves were intact but bare, like wires without insulation. On Earth, demyelinating diseases were difficult to treat. Multiple sclerosis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, neuropathies. Restoring myelin was considered one of the major unsolved problems in neurology. But Daniel knew something. He knew that some venoms have the opposite effect. Tetrodotoxin from the fugu blocks sodium channels. But in microdoses, it can stimulate the regeneration of nerve tissue. This was experimental, controversial. On Earth, this was still in the early stages of research. But here, he himself was the experiment. And his body could produce substances that cost millions of dollars per milligram on Earth. He croaked. He looked at Ari. He began to dictate with croaks, gestures, and his paws, pointing to the ingredients on the shelf. Ari took notes. Hana stood nearby, silent. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her hands no longer clenched the knives. The formula Daniel put together was complex. A base made from local bark, the same as in the morning water, but in different proportions, and a root extract with anti-inflammatory properties. And most importantly, his own secret. Not a poison, not an antitoxin, but something else entirely. a mixture of scorpion neurotoxin and diphtheria protein antitoxin, in a combination that didn't exist on Earth. The neurotoxin in a microdose stimulated the nervous tissue. The antitoxin protected the cells from damage. Together, they created an environment in which the nerves could begin to regenerate the myelin sheath. In theory, he wasn't sure. On Earth, he would have conducted 5 years of clinical trials before giving this to a human. Here, he didn't have 5 years. Hannah's father didn't have 5 years. The wound was spreading. Another year, and the necrosis would reach the spine. Then nothing would help. Hannah left with the vial. Daniel told her through Ari that the results wouldn't be immediate. Weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2. Nerves regenerate slowly, if they regenerate at all. Hannah nodded. She left. She returned 3 weeks later. Daniel was sitting on the shelf and heard footsteps on the path, quick ones, almost a run. The door swung open. Hannah stood in the doorway. Her face was different. Not stony, not empty, alive. She said 2 words. "My hands are moving." Not completely, his fingers. He could wiggle his fingers for the first time in 10 years. That was enough to pick up a spoon, enough to feed himself, enough to hug his daughter. Hannah sat down against the wall, slid to the floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and cried silently. Only her shoulders shook. Ari left the room. Daniel stayed on the shelf, silent. He didn't croak. He didn't draw attention to himself. He just sat there and watched as the grown woman who had kept everything bottled up inside for 10 years finally allowed herself to break down. When Hannah stopped crying, she stood up. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at Daniel, and she said she was staying. She didn't ask. She stated it. She's staying in the village. She'll look after the pharmacy. She'll hunt for the village. She'll do whatever needs to be done. Daniel croaked once. Hannah nodded and left. Ari returned to the room. She looked at Daniel. She quietly asked if everything was all right. He croaked. Once, everything was all right. He now had a hunter. The 5th month began with a visit. Not from merchants, not from the people of the House of So. A woman, young, red-headed, dressed in men's travel clothes, carrying a heavy backpack from which scrolls and glass tubes protruded. She spoke the local language with a strong accent. A foreigner from the northern continent. Madison Verne had not come to Wet Willows for medicine. She had come for knowledge. She was an academic alchemist, a graduate of the Northern College, a specialist in antidote synthesis, the only one in her class to earn the highest degree in poison theory, and the only one whom House So tried to hire, and then, when she refused, tried to kill. She had fled the city 3 weeks ago. They were after her, the house's mercenaries, 2 men. She'd shaken them off in the swamp, but knew they'd pick up her trail. She had maybe 2 days. She'd heard about the yellow frog from a traveling merchant who'd heard it from another merchant. A chain of rumors. She didn't believe it, but she had nowhere else to go. Mididia entered Ari's house and saw Daniel on the shelf. She stopped, adjusted her glasses, leaned in, examined him closely. Then she took a magnifying glass out of her backpack and examined him even more closely. Then she straightened up and said it was impossible, that frogs of this species don't come in that size. That the color pattern didn't match any described species. That the secretions on its skin contained at least 4 different chemical classes, which was physiologically impossible for a single organism. Daniel listened to her and felt an unfamiliar sensation. He didn't identify it right away. Then he realized what it was. Relief. For the first time in 5 months, there was a person nearby who spoke his language. Not in the local language, in the language of science. He croaked. Maddie fell silent. Ari began to explain about the croaking, about the yes and no system, about how the frog understands speech. Maddie listened with the expression of someone whose worldview was crumbling. She sat down on the floor next to the shelf. She took out a notebook and began to ask questions, not simple ones. She asked about the mechanism of action of poisons, about the selectivity of toxins, about how a single body can produce antagonistic compounds simultaneously. Questions that couldn't be answered with a croak. For the first time, Daniel encountered the limitations of his communication system. Yes and no wasn't enough. He needed words, formulas, diagrams. He jumped onto the table, found some ink and a brush, clamped the brush between his front paws, and began to draw. The lines were crooked. Paws aren't meant for writing, but he wasn't drawing letters. He was drawing molecules, ring structures, side chains, functional groups. Maddie looked at his drawings. Her expression changed. First bewilderment, then recognition, then shock. She grabbed the brush and finished drawing one of the structures. She added a hydroxyl group. She looked at Daniel. He croaked twice. No, he wiped away her group with his paw. He drew an amino group in its place. Maddie stared at the drawing. Then she looked at him. Then back at the drawing. She said it was impossible, that frogs don't know organic chemistry, that frogs don't draw molecular structures, that she's going crazy. Daniel croaked twice. No, you're not going crazy, Maddie laughed nervously. Then she fell silent. Then she laughed again, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She said she'd been alone her whole life, that none of her colleagues could discuss theory with her on her level, that professors called her work too complicated, that Dom So wanted to buy her brain the way people buy a tool. And now she's sitting in a village hut drawing molecules with a frog, and the frog is correcting her. Daniel croaked once, quietly. He understood that feeling. Back on Earth, he hadn't had any equals either. Not because he was a genius, but because his field was too narrow, too specialized, too far removed from what interested ordinary people. Maddie became his voice. Over the next 2 weeks, they developed a new system. Daniel drew molecules. Maddie interpreted them. They created a dictionary of about 100 chemical symbols that he could draw with his paws. Not pretty, but clear. Through this dictionary, Daniel was able to explain for the first time how his poisons worked. Not just what they did, but why. The mechanisms at the molecular level. Maddie wrote everything down. She filled her scrolls with tiny handwriting. She argued with him. She asked questions he didn't know the answers to. And it was wonderful. For the first time in 5 months, someone had asked him a question he didn't know the answer to. On the 14th day of her stay, she asked a question that changed everything. She asked about the 7th rot. She had been studying it. In the North, the rot was considered a scientific mystery, a disease that erases one's identity. It doesn't kill the body, it erases the person inside. The rot's victims smiled, they ate, they drank, they worked, but they didn't remember their names. They didn't recognize their loved ones. They felt neither pain nor joy. Quiet, obedient puppets. Maddie spent 2 years studying samples of the rot. She isolated the active substance, a complex neurotropic agent that acts on serotonin and dopamine receptors simultaneously. It didn't destroy the brain, it rewired it. It erased the connections between the neurons responsible for identity, name, attachments, preferences, fears, everything that makes a person a specific person and not just a body. Daniel listened and remembered. Water. In the swamp, that unknown neurotropic agent he'd found on the 11th day, a partial match with serotonin agonists. It was her, the 7th rot. He'd been sitting in her solution and didn't even know what it was. He'd let Madden lick a sample she'd pulled from her backpack in a sealed glass tube. The analysis was long and terrifying, 27 components. He recognized most of them by their structure. But 3 were completely unfamiliar, not a single earthly analog. Molecules that didn't exist in his library of 400 toxins. He sketched the structures of these 3 molecules. Maddie looked at the drawings and shook her head. She couldn't identify them either. 2 scientists, one trapped in a frog's body, the other on the run. Both were looking at molecules that didn't fit into any system they knew. And both understood that until they figured out these 3 components, it would be impossible to create an antidote for the 7th rot. Maddie said she needed a lab, a real one, with equipment, with reagents, with furnaces and distillation stills. What the local alchemists called a workshop. Daniel croaked once. He needed a lab, too. But first, he needed to grow to a size where he could work with his hands, or whatever served as his hands. Maddie looked at him and said she had an idea. She pulled a small vial out of her backpack. Inside was a thick green liquid, marsh salamander extract, a regeneration stimulant. Up north, they used it to speed up wound healing, but in theory, it could also accelerate growth if the body already had a tendency to grow. Daniel looked at the vial, then at Maddie. He licked the stopper. Analysis revealed familiar structures, growth factors, analogs of insulin like growth factor, but at a concentration that was excessive for his body. If he took it at the current dosage, his body would try to grow too fast. His bones wouldn't hold up, his organs wouldn't keep up, he'd die from his own growth. But if he diluted it, if he calculated the exact dose for his body mass, if he took 1 drop a day, he sketched out the calculation on the table. Maddie checked it. She nodded. They diluted the extract 20-fold. Daniel drank the first drop. Warmth spread through his body. His bones hummed. His muscles tensed. He felt something shift inside him, like a mechanism that had been running at one speed suddenly shifted to another. Over the next 2 weeks, he grew from 6 to 10 centimeters, the size of an adult's palm. That was bigger than any frog on Earth, and that was just the beginning. Maddie made special drops for him to treat his migraines. He formulated the recipe based on her own notes, which he'd shown him one evening while complaining of a headache. The notes were written in 4 languages mixed together in a single text. No one but her could read them. Daniel read them. Not the languages, the chemical formulas between the lines. And he concocted an analgesic from local herbs tailored precisely to her biochemistry. Maddie drank it, and 10 minutes later, for the first time in 10 years, her head didn't hurt. She sat on the floor, holding the little pot containing the remedy in her hands. Her glasses were fogged up. She said quietly that he was the first person to read her notes, the first to understand what she meant, the first person she could just talk to. Daniel croaked once and thought that for a frog in a pot, he had a suspiciously large number of women crying next to him. The decision about the pharmacy was made at the end of the 5th month, not by Daniel, by Eddie. She said that sitting in the village and waiting was pointless. So's house would sooner or later send soldiers, not merchants, and that the only way to protect themselves was to become visible, to become indispensable, to become the kind of people who couldn't be quietly eliminated because too many people depended on them, Daniel croaked, just once. He understood the logic. You can't defeat a monopoly by hiding in a village. You can only defeat a monopoly by creating a competitor. The nearest town was called Lower Mist, a 2-day journey from Wet Willows, a border trading post, a population of about 3,000, fishermen, hunters, merchants, mercenaries, a place through which caravans passed from the marsh provinces to the central lands. The town had a house of pharmacy, the only one. Prices were 3 times higher than in the capital. The selection was half as large. The pharmacist was appointed by the house. Old, indifferent. He sold morning water and basic antidotes and wasn't interested in anything but his cut. Maddie suggested opening a second pharmacy right across the street. Hannah said it was suicide. Ari didn't say anything. She just started gathering herbs. They arrived in Lower Mist at the beginning of the 6th month, Maddie in men's clothing and with someone else's documents, Ari with a basket of herbs and her younger brother, Hannah with knives and a look on her face that made people cross to the other side of the street, and Daniel in a glass jar on the counter. Maddie had found the jar at a glass blower's in Lower Mist, a wide one with holes in the lid, with a cushion of moss at the bottom. Daniel sat on the moss and looked out at the street through the glass. Ari painted the sign, the Yellow Lord's Pharmacy. The letters were crooked, the paint had run in places, but it was visible from the other end of the street. No one came on the first day, nor on the second. On the 3rd day, an old man walked in. He looked around the shelves. He looked at the jar with the frog. He asked Ari whose pharmacy it was. Ari replied that the pharmacy belonged to the Yellow Lord. The old man asked who that was. Ari pointed to the jar. The old man looked at the jar. The frog in the jar looked at the old man. The old man turned around and left. Daniel croaked. There was something like a sigh in that croak. The first real customer came on the 5th day, a woman in her 40s with a swollen knee. She was limping. Her face was ashen with pain. She said that the pharmacist at the House of So had charged a price for the joint ointment that she couldn't afford. She'd heard it was cheaper here. Maddie examined the knee. She asked how long it had been hurting. The woman replied, 8 years. Maddie showed the knee to Daniel. He hopped out of the jar onto the counter. The woman recoiled. Maddie reassured her. Daniel asked Maddie to give him a rag soaked in liquid from the knee. Maddie carefully squeezed a drop from the swollen joint onto the cloth. Daniel licked it. Inflammatory exudate. Acute phase proteins. Uric acid crystals. Gout. Classic gout. On Earth, it was treated with colchicine and allopurinol. There was no colchicine here, but there was colchicum. Maddie had told him a week ago that a local equivalent of colchicum grew in the marshes. Colchicine hadn't been extracted from it because the plant was considered too poisonous to work with, for everyone except Daniel. He sketched out a prescription on the counter. Maddie translated it. Ari found the right plant in her basket. They prepared the ointment in an hour. Daniel added a drop of his own secret, an anti-inflammatory mixture based on a modified wasp peptide. The dosage was calculated based on the woman's weight and the severity of the inflammation. Not a generic ointment for everyone, but a specific ointment for a specific knee. The woman applied it. 20 minutes later, the swelling began to subside. An hour later, she bent her knee. For the first time in 8 years, without pain, she stood in the middle of the pharmacy, bending and straightening her leg over and over again, like a child learning to walk. Then she looked at the jar with the frog sitting on the counter, staring at her with its round, golden eyes. The woman bowed. Ari named the price, a third of what the pharmacist at the House of So had asked. The woman paid and left straight away, without any hesitation. By the end of the first week, 12 people had come to them. By the end of the second, 30. By the end of the month, the Yellow Lord's pharmacy was seeing 10 patients a day. Maddie examined them. Ari prepared the concoctions. Hannah kept things in order. Daniel analyzed and wrote out prescriptions. Each concoction was unique. Each was tailored to a specific person. It was a slow process, much slower than the House of So's method, where they sold the same syrup to the whole street. But it worked. Rumors spread. The pharmacy where a frog heals people. The pharmacy where medicines are personally tailored. The pharmacy where prices are half as much. Ridiculous, strange, unbelievable, but true. The first killer came in the 4th week. Hannah spotted him before he even walked through the door. She was sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife. The man was walking down the street too steadily, too calmly. His eyes weren't scanning the surroundings. They were fixed on the pharmacy door. His hands were in his pockets. Hannah stood up. She blocked the entrance. The man stopped. He looked at her. Hannah said the pharmacy was closed. The man said he needed medicine. Hannah said the pharmacy was closed. The man took his hand out of his pocket. He was holding a knife, a short one, with a serrated blade, a knife for gutting, not for fighting. Hannah struck him on the wrist before he could raise his hand. The knife flew into the mud. The man tried to strike her with his left hand. Hannah grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, shoved his face against the wall, pinned him down with her knee. It all took 3 seconds. She asked who had sent him. The man remained silent. Hannah pressed harder. He spoke. Not Damso. An independent contract. Someone from the city's upper echelons who didn't like the competition. A small-time official. A small knife. A small-time attempt. Hannah let him go. He walked away, holding his arm. Daniel sat in the bank and watched. This was the beginning. The first of many. He knew there would be more. Bigger, more dangerous, more professional. He needed to grow faster, and he needed a weapon that didn't require hands. The next day, he asked Hannah to bring him a sample of the local Vexper's venom, that very same green snake with yellow rings that had chased him during his first week. Hannah went into the swamp for 2 days. She returned with a flask in which something dark sloshed about. Viper venom, fresh, concentrated. Hannah had extracted it from a live snake. Daniel didn't ask exactly how she'd done it. She had fresh cuts on her hands. He licked the venom. 4 components. He had identified all four during that first week from the traces on the bark: neurotoxin, hemotoxin, cytotoxin, and that fourth one, unknown, one that didn't exist on Earth. The analysis system fully broke down the fourth component. It took 3 minutes instead of the usual 2 seconds. The structure was complex, multi-component, with elements he couldn't classify under any known class. The text in his head was different, not the usual dry report. An energy component has been detected. Classification is impossible within the current database. Physical contact is recommended for full assimilation. An energy component, not a chemical one. Energetic. That was a new word. Daniel didn't know what it meant in the context of this world, but he knew that the fourth component of the snake venom was connected to something beyond chemistry, something the locals called spiritual energy, and about which he knew nothing yet. Park Yuri arrived in Lower Mist in a closed palanquin in the middle of the 6th month. 2 porters, 1 servant, and a young woman behind a curtain who could not walk on her own. The servant entered the pharmacy first, an elderly man, with the face of someone who had long since given up hope but carried on out of habit. He said his mistress was ill, that she was the daughter of an aristocratic family, that he could not reveal her name, that she needed help. Maddie asked what was wrong. The servant said one word: poison. Yuri was carried into the pharmacy on a stretcher. She was thin, unnaturally thin. Her skin was gray with a greenish tint, dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were as thin as bird bones. But she lay on the stretcher with her back straight. Even lying down, she maintained her posture, a habit ingrained since childhood, a habit that remained when everything else was gone. Daniel jumped down from the counter onto the stretcher. Yuri looked at him. She wasn't scared. She wasn't surprised. She looked at him the way one looks at yet another doctor, without hope and without irritation. With the polite indifference of someone who's grown tired of waiting for a miracle. He asked Maddie to take a sample. Maddie pricked Yuri's finger with a fine needle. A drop of blood fell onto the sheet of paper held beneath it. Daniel licked it. The analysis took neither 2 seconds nor 10. 30. The system sifted through the data as if it didn't believe its own findings, because there wasn't just one toxin in Yuri's blood. 4. 4 different toxins layered on top of one another. The first layer, chronic, long-standing, an arsenic-like compound. It had been accumulating for years. It was destroying the liver and kidneys slowly and imperceptibly, like rust-corroding iron. The second layer, of moderate age, a plant-derived alkaloid similar to strychnine but milder. It caused constant muscle tension, pain in the back and neck, nighttime cramps. The third layer, relatively recent, a peptide-based neurotoxin. It suppressed her appetite. It suppressed the feeling of hunger. Yuri literally couldn't eat. Her body refused food, not because she didn't want to, but because the poison was telling her brain that she was full. Fourth layer, the thinnest, the most insidious. Microdoses of something that affected the emotional centers. It suppressed her will. It extinguished her desire to resist. It made her obedient. 4 poisons. 4 different specialists, 4 different goals. Someone wanted to kill Yuri, but not quickly, slowly, quietly, so that she would fade away on her own, so that everyone would think she was just weak, just sick, just an unfortunate girl who'd had bad luck with her health. Daniel sat on the stretcher and felt something inside him tighten, not scientific interest, not professional curiosity, anger. The same specific, focused anger he'd felt when he learned the composition of the morning water, only stronger. Someone had spent years trying to kill this girl. Someone had selected poisons the way an artist selects paints, layer by layer, shade by shade, professionally, beautifully, disgustingly. He looked at Maddie. He began to draw. Quickly, 4 structures, 4 arrows, 4 targets in the body. Maddie looked at the drawings and turned pale. She understood. Ari stood in the doorway and understood too. Hana stood by the wall, gripping the hilt of a knife. Yuri lay on the stretcher, not understanding a thing. She was used to doctors shaking their heads and saying there was nothing they could do. She was expecting the same thing. Daniel had drawn up 7 prescriptions. Not just 1, 7. Each for a different layer of poison, each with a precise dosage, each with a schedule for administration. A morning formula to bind the arsenic, an afternoon one to block the strychnine-like alkaloid, an evening formula to restore her appetite, a nighttime formula to protect her nervous system while she sleeps. In between, 3 intermediate formulas to support her liver and kidneys. 7 formulas to be taken at different times of the day in a specific order. Disrupting the order is dangerous because some antidotes conflict with each other and must be spaced at least 3 hours apart. Maddie wrote everything down. Ari began gathering the ingredients. Hana went into the swamp for 2 components that weren't in stock. Yuri lay on the stretcher and watched the commotion around her. For the first time in a long while, something other than emptiness appeared in her eyes. Not hope, not yet. Surprise. No one had ever fussed over her before. No one had ever run through the swamp for ingredients. No one had ever written out 7 recipes. Usually, they'd give her a single bottle of syrup and tell her to take it 3 times a day. And it didn't help. She drank the first bottle that very evening, the morning antidote for arsenic. That night, she started feeling sick, very sick. Her body was expelling the accumulated poison, and the process was painful. She spent the night in the back room of the pharmacy. Ari sat beside her, changing her rags, bringing her water. Yuri moaned and writhed. Sweat poured down in streams. Her skin broke out in red spots. Her body was ridding itself of what had built up over the years. By morning, she was as weak as a kitten, but the color of her skin had changed. The grayish-green tint had turned simply gray. The arsenic was leaving her system. On the second day, she took the daytime formula. Her muscles relaxed for the first time in years. She could turn her neck without pain. She could raise her arms above her shoulders. On the 3rd day, the evening formula restored her appetite. She ate a bowl of rice porridge and asked for seconds. Ari burst into tears. The servant stood in the doorway, unable to speak. His lips were trembling. On the 4th day, the nighttime formula lifted the suppression of her will. Yuri woke up in the morning, and for the first time in years, her first thought was not resigned acceptance of the pain, but anger, real, raw anger at those who had done this to her. She got up from the cot, on her own, without help. She made her way to the counter. She looked at the jar where Daniel was sitting, and she bowed deeply all the way to the floor. Her forehead touched the floorboards. She said she didn't know who he was, that she didn't understand how a frog could heal people, but that her life now belonged to him. Daniel croaked in panic. He didn't want anyone's life to belong to him. He wanted people to be well. Those are 2 different things. But Yuri had already made up her mind. She stayed at the pharmacy. A week later, she was helping Ari sort herbs. 2 weeks later, she was keeping patient records. Her handwriting was impeccable. Her manners were impeccable. Her knowledge of aristocratic etiquette proved unexpectedly useful when wealthy clients from the commercial district began coming to the pharmacy. Yuri greeted them with a smile and her back straight. No one suspected that a month ago she hadn't been able to get out of bed. The treatment lasted 2 months, 7 formulations, every day without fail. Daniel adjusted the dosages every week. He licked a drop of her blood, checked her levels, adjusted the proportions, individualized therapy, personalized medicine, what he'd been doing his whole life on Earth. Only there, it cost tens of thousands of dollars. Here, it cost a frog's saliva and a handful of herbs. By the end of the 7th month, Daniel was the size of a palm, 10 centimeters, heavy, solid. His skin had darkened from bright yellow. It was now golden with dark brown stripes instead of black streaks. He had assimilated 11 poisons. He actively produced 9 of them. 2 were too resource-intensive for constant synthesis and were activated only when necessary. His body was a laboratory, compact, mobile. deadly to anyone who might try to taste him, but he was still a frog. Maddie first mentioned the transformation in the 8th month. She studied his growth, measured it, recorded it, plotted graphs on her scrolls. She noticed a pattern. Each new toxin didn't just add muscle, it was restructuring part of his body. His muscles were getting denser, his bones harder, his neural pathways more complex. His body wasn't evolving into a larger frog, it was evolving into something else. Maddie asked him directly, did he know what would happen when the amount of absorbed toxins reached a critical mass? Daniel didn't know. The system didn't provide predictions, only current data, but he could sense it. He sensed that the body was preparing for something, as if each new toxin were not a separate tool, but a piece of a construction set. And when there were enough pieces, the set would assemble itself. In the 9th month, Julia Donovan came to the pharmacy, a tall woman with broad shoulders and hands that looked as if they'd been kneading dough her whole life, or bandaging wounds, or both. She was the abbess of a monastic hospital, the only place in 3 provinces that accepted those infected with the 7th rot. The hospital stood on an island in the middle of a marshy lake, a half-day's journey from Lower Mist. 20 beds, 30 patients, people with empty smiles and empty eyes, people who didn't remember their own names. Julia came to town once a month for supplies. She'd heard about the Yellow Lord's pharmacy. She didn't come for medicine. She came to look around. She walked in. She scanned the shelves. She looked at the staff, at Maddie with her scrolls, at Ari with her bundles of herbs, at Hannah with her knives, at Yuri with her impeccable posture and patient lists. Then she looked at the jar on the counter, at the golden frog inside. The frog looked at her. Julia didn't bow. She wasn't scared. She didn't laugh. She walked over to the counter. She opened the jar. She poured some milk from the flask on her belt into a small dish. She set it in front of Daniel and said calmly, "Please drink. Mr. Frog, you need it." Daniel looked at the milk. He looked at Julia. Frogs don't drink milk. But there was something in her voice, something in her hands, something in the way she stood, firmly, tired, unyielding. He hopped into the saucer, not to drink, just to sit in it. Warm. The milk was warm. Julia told him about the hospital, about her patients, about how someone dies every week, not from rot. Rot doesn't kill. From complications. The infected can't take care of themselves. They don't remember to eat. They don't remember to drink. They don't remember to breathe when they catch a cold. They die of pneumonia, of dehydration, of bed sores, quietly, with a smile on their faces. Julia buried them every week for 16 years. She had forgotten the last time one of her patients had recovered. She didn't ask for a cure for rot. She knew it didn't exist. She asked for help with the rest, with pneumonia, with fevers, with infections, with the things that could be treated. So that at least they wouldn't die from something that could be treated, but from something that couldn't yet be. Daniel croaked, just once. The next day, he asked Hannah to take him to the island. Hannah objected. She said that rot was contagious, that a frog had no business being among the infected, that it was dangerous. Daniel croaked. Just once, they went. The hospital was small, made of wood, clean despite everything. Julia kept it in good order. The floors were washed, the linens were washed, the windows were open, but the smell lingered anyway, the smell of bodies that were slowly forgetting how to be alive. Daniel examined every patient, all 30 of them. Ari carried him from bed to bed. He licked their skin. He licked their bandages. He licked the sweat from their foreheads. Each time, the test results came back the same. 7th rot. The same 27 components he'd seen in Maddie's sample. The same 3 unknown molecules. He didn't know of any antidotes. But he knew pneumonia. He knew fever, he knew infection. In 2 days on the island, he had written 17 individual prescriptions, 17 antibacterial formulations, each tailored to a specific patient, to their weight, age, medical history, and what they ate and didn't eat. Maddie took notes. Ari prepared the medications, Julia handed them out. The first result came 3 days later. An elderly coal miner with chronic pneumonia. He'd been coughing for a month. His fever wouldn't break. Julia had been preparing him for death. Daniel's formula stopped the infection within 2 days. On the third day, the old man was sitting up in bed eating porridge. He still couldn't remember his name. He was still smiling that vacant smile. But he was alive, and the cough was gone. Julia sat by his bed all night after it became clear he would recover. In the morning, she went to see Daniel. He was sitting on the windowsill. She walked over. She cupped him in her hands. She just held him. She didn't say a word. Her hands were large and warm. They smelled of bread and herbs. Daniel sat in her palms, and for the first time in 9 months, didn't feel like a scientist. Not a tool, not a poison detector, a human being, small, yellow, wet, but a human being. They returned to Lower Mist a week later. Daniel put together a month's supply of medicine for the hospital. Maddie taught Julia some basic recipes. Ari left a basket of herbs. Julia promised to come by for more every 2 weeks. On the way back through the swamp, Daniel sat in a little pot attached to Ari's belt and thought. He was treating the symptoms, not the disease itself. He was treating pneumonia in people with rot. He was patching up cracks in the crumbling wall. To truly help, he needed an antidote for rot, and for that, he needed to decipher those 3 unknown molecules. And for that, he needed a lab. And for a lab, he needed hands. Human hands, or at least something resembling hands. That night, he felt it. Warmth, not from the outside, from the inside. Deep at the center of his body, as if something had awakened, something that had been building up for 11 poisons and 9 months, something that had finally gained mass. His body hummed, his bones ached, his skin tightened, his muscles began to twitch. Daniel fell out of the pot onto the table. Ari jumped up. Maddie rushed over to him. Hannah grabbed a knife, not understanding what was happening. Yuri stood up from the table where she'd been taking notes. Daniel was lying on the table, and his body was changing. He could feel his bones lengthening, his muscles rearranging themselves, his skin stretching, something new growing where his paws used to be. Fingers, long, slender, webbed, but fingers. His body was stretching, growing, changing. The pain was unbearable. Worse than any poisoning, worse than a wasp sting, worse than a spider's paralysis. Every cell was breaking apart and reassembling. He screamed. He wasn't croaking, he was screaming. The sound was something between a croak and a human scream, horrifying. Maddie held him by what used to be his hand. Ari wiped the sweat from his face with a rag. Hannah stood by the door and wouldn't let anyone in. Yuri prayed. The transformation lasted 2 hours. When it was over, a creature about 60 centimeters tall lay on the table. Green skin with a golden sheen, webbed fingers and toes, large golden eyes, a hairless head with a smooth skull, a slender body, slender arms, slender legs. It looked like a human, and yet not quite. Something in between, something between a frog and a human. Daniel lay on the table, breathing. Heavily, raspy. His body trembled, but he had arms. He had fingers. He had a mouth that could speak words. He opened his mouth. His tongue didn't move the way it used to. His lips were different, but the muscles of his larynx remembered. His brain remembered. He spoke his first word in 9 months. His voice was hoarse, raspy, wet, but it was a word. He said, "Thank you," in a language they didn't know, in English. Then he tried it in the local language. It came out crooked, but it came out. Ari heard his voice and began to cry. Maddie took off her glasses and wiped them with the edge of her sleeve, even though they weren't dirty. Hannah turned away. Daniel sat down on the table. He raised his hands. He looked at them. Green, webbed, with slender, agile fingers. He clenched his fist, unclenched it, wiggled each finger separately. They obeyed. He could work. He could write. He could hold a mortar and pestle. He could mix compounds. He could do what he was created to do. Then his body twitched. The warmth faded. His bones began to ache in the opposite direction. The transformation began to reverse. 10 minutes later, a frog was sitting on the table again, golden, 10 centimeters long, wet, shivering. The first transformation lasted 12 minutes. Not 2 hours, 12 minutes. Then he went into a coma for a day. He lay in the pot and didn't move. Ari watered him every hour. Maddie recorded the readings. When he woke up, Maddie was sitting next to him with her calculations. She had figured it out. Each new toxin extends the duration of the transformation. If the pattern is linear, then with 20 absorbed toxins, he'll be able to maintain his form for about an hour. With 30, about 3 hours. With 50, consistently. He needed 39 more toxins. Daniel croaked and thought that the road ahead would be long. So Min-ji appeared in lower fog at the beginning of the 10th month. She hadn't come for help. She'd come with a warning. Tall. Short-cropped hair, wearing a men's jacket and boots splattered with swamp mud. A narrow sword in a plain scabbard hung at her waist. Her face was stern and angular, with a thin scar across her right eyebrow. She entered the pharmacy an hour before closing time. Hana intercepted her at the door. Min-ji didn't bother to explain. She pointed to the crest on the inside of her jacket collar, a white flower on a black field. House. So. Hana drew a knife. Min-ji didn't budge. She said she hadn't come on behalf of the house, that she'd left the house 2 years ago, that her name was now cursed in the family halls, and that the Yellow Lord's pharmacy had exactly 3 weeks before So Jae-hyuk sent not assassins, but an army. They let her in, not right away. Hana held the knife to her throat while Maddie asked questions. Min-ji answered calmly and matter-of-factly. She knew the inner workings of the House of So. She knew the names of the suppliers. She knew the caravan routes. She knew the formulas for the main medications. And she knew something that no one outside the family knew. She knew about the cellars of the main estate. About what went on in the lower levels, where even senior clan members were not allowed. About the screams that sometimes drifted up from there at night. She said she left the family when she learned about the Village of the Silent, a settlement 2 days' journey to the south. 300 residents, all infected with the 7th rot, all smiling, all working, all obeying. House. So bought this village for a song. The land, the houses, the people, everything. The infected residents worked on plantations of poisonous herbs. Without pay, without complaints, without resistance. Perfect workers. Not slaves, because technically they're free. They just don't remember what freedom is. Min-ji said there are 7 such villages. 7 settlements bought by Dom So over the course of 10 years. All in infected territories. All quiet. All obedient. Daniel sat in the bank and listened. His front paws were trembling, not from fear, but from a rage he couldn't express with a croak. He asked Maddie to ask her directly. The House of So is spreading the rot on purpose. Min-ji was silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't know, that she suspected as much, that this was exactly why she'd left. But she had no proof. Any evidence, if it existed, was kept in the basements of the main estate, a place she'd never gone down to. Daniel croaked. Once! Then he hopped onto the table and began to draw. Not molecules. A map. A crooked, rough, but recognizable map of the province. He marked points, 7 villages, the estate, Lower Mist, Wet Willows, and the swamp. The 1,000-flower swamp from which the rot rose. Min-ji looked at the map and nodded slowly. She said he was the first person to talk to her, not just her last name. The first to ask what she knew, rather than checking to see if she was a spy. Hana put away the knife, not right away, but she did put it away. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks before the House of So's attack. Daniel made the most of that time. Every day, he absorbed a new poison. Hana and Min-ji would go into the swamp together. Hana knew where to find poisonous creatures. Min-ji knew which poisons the House of So used and which antidotes would be needed. They brought back samples. Daniel licked them. He analyzed them. He absorbed them. The pain became familiar. Not bearable, just familiar. He'd wake up from convulsions. He'd lose consciousness from paralysis. He'd vomit from toxins, destroying his stomach lining. And each time he came to with a new poison in his arsenal, by the end of 3 weeks, he had assimilated 22 poisons. The transformation lasted 40 minutes. That wasn't enough for stable functioning, but it was enough to speak, to write, to think aloud, and to hug a person for the first time. He transformed at night, quietly, without a scream. His body had already getting used to the process. The pain was there, but it was dull, a background ache, like an old wound on a rainy day. He stood up from the table, 65 centimeters tall, green skin, golden eyes, webbed fingers. He walked over to Ari. The girl was sleeping on a cot in the back room, curled up in a ball. A notebook lay nearby, within reach. He stood there looking at her. This girl had carried him in her pocket for half a year. Fed him flies. She'd talked to him as if he were a person when he was a frog the size of a fingernail. She'd believed in him when there was nothing else to believe in. He gently touched her shoulder. Ari opened her eyes. She saw him, his face, his hands, his eyes, which she knew, golden, round. The very same ones. She sat up. He hugged her, awkwardly, with hands that weren't used to hugging yet. With hands that were too thin and too long. Ari hugged him back, tightly, childishly, with her whole body, and she whispered the word he'd heard her say when she cried at night, thinking he was asleep. The word she'd spoken not to him, but into the void. Family. 38 minutes later, he turned back into a frog. He sat on the table, wet and shivering. Ari sat beside him and stroked his back with her fingertip, gently, through a cloth, because even after everything that had happened between them, she remembered that his skin was deadly. The House of So's strike came at dawn on the 23rd day, not the army, worse. So Jae-hyuk arrived in person in a black carriage bearing the family crest, with a 12-man guard in leather armor, and with a document from the provincial magistrate. The document stated that the Yellow Lord's pharmacy was operating without a license from the Apothecaries Guild, that all preparations produced without certification from the House of So were contraband, that the premises were subject to confiscation, the goods were subject to destruction, the staff were subject to arrest. Everything was legal, everything was by the book. A document with an official seal. So Jae-hyuk walked into the pharmacy like the owner, 46 years old, of average height, thin, wearing an expensive dark lab coat. His face was calm and pleasant, a gentle smile, attentive eyes. He surveyed the shelves, ran his finger along the counter, looked at the jar, at the frog inside, leaned down, smiled, said he'd heard all about it, that he was impressed, that the little creature had caused quite a stir, and that now it was time to put an end to the commotion. Hana stood by the wall and counted the guards. 12. Too many for her alone. Minji was standing in the back room. If Jae-hyuk saw her, he'd realize the leak had come from within the family. And then it wouldn't be an arrest. It would be an execution. Maddie kept her hand on the backpack containing all the scrolls with the formulas. If the pharmacy was confiscated, the formulas couldn't be lost. Ari stood next to the counter and looked at Jae-hyuk without fear, with that same quiet stubbornness with which she went out to the swamp every day and brought him food every day when he was no bigger than a fingernail. Yuri stepped forward, calmly, with her back straight, with the impeccable poise of a daughter of an aristocratic family. She introduced herself by her full name with her title, Park Yuri, the third daughter of the House of Park, a house that had fallen from grace but had not been stripped of its privileges, an aristocratic house whose name still carried weight in the capital. So Jae-hyuk looked at her. His smile remained the same, but his eyes had changed. He knew that name. He knew that although the Park family had been weakened, it still had connections at court. The arrest of a daughter of the Park family was not the same as the arrest of a village herbalist. It was a diplomatic incident. Yuri said that this pharmacy was under her personal, that she was prepared to write to the capital, that the charge of smuggling could easily be refuted by an expert analysis, which she was prepared to request from the court alchemists. Sao Jae-hyuk remained silent for 10 seconds. Then he smiled again, more broadly. He said it was a misunderstanding, that he hadn't known of the noble house's presence, that the licensing issue could be resolved through the chamber, that he would stop by later. He turned and left. The guards followed him out. The carriage drove away. The pharmacy staff breathed a sigh of relief. Hana said it was only temporary, that Jae-hyuk would return, that next time he'd be prepared for Yuri's presence, That next time, the document would come not from the magistrate, but from the court itself. Daniel knew she was right. Yuri had bought some time, not a victory. He needed more poisons, more power, more opportunities. And he needed the truth about what was hidden in the cellars of the So estate. Minji told him everything she knew that very evening. The estate's cellars were off limits to everyone except Jae Hyuk and his 2 personal alchemists. Guards stood at every turn, 3 levels down. On the lowest level was a room the family called the Cradle. No one knew what was inside. Min Ji heard sounds as she walked past the locked door. Not screams, mumbling, quiet, continuous mumbling in a language she didn't understand. Daniel froze, mumbling in an unfamiliar language. A basement locked away for 20 years. A secret guarded by the entire clan. He recalled the analysis of the 7th rot. 2717 components. 24 identified. 3 not. 3 molecules that didn't exist in the natural world of this realm. That didn't exist on Earth either. Molecules that no local alchemist could have created, because they were created by someone from outside this world. He drew the 3 molecules on the table. He looked at Maddie. Maddie looked at the drawings, then at him. Then her expression changed. She understood. Before he even spoke, she whispered a single word: Earth. These molecules were from Earth, not natural, synthetic, created in a laboratory by someone who knew organic chemistry at a level that didn't exist in this world, by someone who had arrived here earlier, much earlier. Daniel croaked, once, heavily. He wasn't the first. Another Earthling had been sitting in the cellars of the So estate for 200 years. A chemist, a scientist, a man whose brain and body were used to create the 7th rot. Maddie said it was impossible, that a human couldn't live for 200 years. Daniel looked at himself, a palm-sized frog that absorbs poisons and transforms into half-humans. He croaked twice. Maddie fell silent. The next 2 months became the most intense of his life, of both his lives. During the day, he worked at the pharmacy. He saw patients. He wrote prescriptions. He trained Ari and Maddie. At night, he absorbed poisons. Hana and Minji brought samples from all over the province. Snakes, scorpions, spiders, mushrooms, lichens, algae, fish, even a jellyfish from a brackish lake on the provincial border. Each new poison was harder to handle than the last. His body resisted. Adapting took days, not hours. The pain didn't subside between sessions. He lived in a constant state of poisoning. Maddie said he was killing himself. Ari cried. Hana remained silent and brought the next sample. By the end of the 12th month, he had 34 venoms. The transformation lasted 2.5 hours. He could speak, he could walk, he could use his hands, he could read and write in the local language, which he'd learned from Maddie over the past few months. And he developed the first effective antidote for a mild form of the 7th rot. Not a complete one, a partial one. It didn't restore memory, but it stopped the spread. A person who took the remedy stopped losing themselves any further. They froze at whatever stage they were in. Julia brought 5 patients with early-stage rot from the island. Daniel treated each one personally. Individual dosages, personalized formulations. 3 out of 5 showed improvement, not a cure. Stabilization, a halt to the process. In a world where rot was considered incurable, this was a miracle. In the 14th month, Daniel went out into the city in human form for the first time. Not for 40 minutes, for 4 hours, 41 venom. His body held its shape more steadily. Green skin, webbed hands and feet, golden eyes, a hooded cloak thrown over his shoulders. Ari pulled the boots over his webbed feet. They were 5 sizes too big for her and 2 sizes too small for him. Maddie said he looked like a swamp spirit from children's fairy tales. Hana said he looked like a target for every hunter in town. Yuri said the cloak was crooked and smoothed out the folds. Minji said nothing. She simply stood to his left and placed her hand on his sword. He walked down Lower Mist Street and people parted to let him pass. Not out of fear, out of bewilderment. A green face under the hood, wet boot prints, The smell of the swamp and grass. Someone whispered about a spirit, someone else about a curse. Someone recognized the color of his skin and shouted that it was the Yellow Lord, that the frog from the apothecary had become human by the end of the day. The whole city knew about it. Daniel was heading toward the commercial district. He needed equipment for the lab, glassware, distillation stills, measuring vessels, everything that Maddie couldn't find in the swamp. He went into the shops. He talked. His voice was hoarse and raspy, but his words were precise. He spoke the local language with an accent that no one could place. The merchants looked at him warily, but sold him what he needed. Money was money, regardless of the buyer's skin color. On the way back, he was ambushed. 4 of them, not city thugs, professionals in identical gray jackets with identical short swords, mercenaries of the House of So. Not the ones who'd come with Jae-hyuk. Different ones, the night squad, the ones who work when paperwork doesn't help. They blocked the alley, 2 in front, 2 behind. Minji stepped forward. Her sword slid out of its sheath. She was good. Daniel could tell by the way the mercenaries moved. They recognized the style. The House of So's style. Their own style. One of them said the traitor would be punished separately. Minji replied that he could try. Daniel removed the glove from his right hand. Green, webbed fingers. Damp, glistening in the lantern light. He stepped forward and touched the wall. With a single finger, a wet spot remained on the stone. 3 seconds later, the stone around the spot darkened. 5 seconds later, it began to crumble. Acid, concentrated. A mixture of 3 components that was corroding the stone. It would eat away at living tissues even faster. The mercenaries stared at the wall, at his hand, at the stain. One of them swallowed hard. Daniel said quietly that he didn't want to hurt anyone, that his skin could release 26 different toxins, that he could paralyze, blind, stop a heart, dissolve skin down to the bone, or simply put someone to sleep. The choice was theirs. He wasn't bluffing. Every word was true. 3 of the 4 mercenaries retreated. The 4th lunged forward. Minji intercepted his sword with her own. She deflected it to the side. Daniel touched his wrist with his bare hand. The mercenary flinched. His eyes rolled back. He fell, alive, paralyzed. For 12 hours. The remaining 3 left. Minji sheathed her sword. She looked at Daniel. He was standing in the alleyway in a soaked raincoat, his bare webbed feet exposed, a bead of sweat on his green forehead. Minji said that, for a frog, he was quite scary. Daniel replied that for a defector, she was quite loyal. She looked at him for a long time, and then she said he was the first person to talk to her, and not just her last name. Daniel replied that she'd already said that. Minji smiled for the first time since they'd met. He spent the next 3 months in the lab, a real lab that Maddie had set up on the 2nd floor of the pharmacy, glass flasks, distillation stills, burners, measuring vessels, not a mass spectrometer, of course. But for this world, it was state-of-the-art equipment. Maddie worked right beside him. They could finally talk. Really talk. Not with croaks or drawings, with words, with formulas. With arguments that went on until their voices were hoarse at 3 in the morning. They dissected the 7th rot molecule by molecule. Daniel fully understood 24 of the components. 3 remained a mystery, those very synthetic molecules from Earth. He knew their structure, but he didn't understand the mechanism, because the mechanism was tied to what Maddie called spiritual energy, and he called the 4th component of snake venom to something that had no equivalent in Earth's chemistry, that which made this world different. Maddie had explained the basics to him. Spiritual energy permeated all living things in Hyunryeon, plants, animals, and people. It flowed through channels in the body like blood, through vessels. Local alchemists used it intuitively. They added it to their concoctions. They enhanced the effects of medicines, but no one understood how it worked at the molecular level. For Daniel, it was like discovering a new branch of physics, a new force, a new type of interaction. He began experimenting, using his own body as a test subject. He ingested poisons containing an energetic component, analyzed them, he compared them. He built a model 2 months later, he had a hypothesis. Spiritual energy was not magic. It was a form of bioelectricity, specific to this world, generated by living organisms, transmitted through fluids and tissues, measurable, predictable, and controllable. And the three unknown molecules in the composition of Ganil were designed to interact specifically with this energy. They redirected bioelectric currents in the brain. They erased the patterns that shaped a person's identity, name, memory, attachments, everything that made a person who they were. That first earthling, that chemist in the basement. He had figured out spiritual energy before Daniel did, 200 years earlier, and he used that knowledge to create the perfect instrument of control, or he was forced to. Daniel had to find out. Daniel had been planning the assault on the So estate for 3 weeks, not as a soldier, as a toxicologist. He wasn't preparing weapons, but tools. 37 vials with various compounds. Paralytics, sleep gases, contact anesthetics, irritants for the eye mucosa, emetics, not a single poison intended to kill. Each compound with a precise dosage. Each calculated for an average adult male weighing between 60 and 90 kilograms, each with a duration of effect ranging from 15 minutes to 12 hours. Maddie checked each ampule twice. Ari wrapped them in soft cloth. Hannah sharpened the knives. Minji drew a floor plan of the estate from memory. 3 floors up, 3 levels down, 22 guards on the day shift, 16 on the night shift. 2 alchemists who never left the laboratory on the 2nd underground level, and the cradle on the 3rd underground level, behind 3 locked doors. Yuri wrote a letter, 1 letter to the capital, to the operator's court, with a detailed description of what the House of So is doing to the infected villages, with names, with dates, with a list of land transactions. Minjie provided the information. Yuri put it together, the seal of the park house. The letter was sent by courier 2 weeks before the assault. Even if the assault fails, the letter will reach its destination. Even if they all die, the information will survive. Julia arrived from the island. She brought 3 recovering patients and a set of surgical instruments. She said she would go with them. Not at the manor. To the camp by the wall. She'll be waiting with bandages and antiseptic, because someone has to tend to those who fall. It was a rainy night. Daniel stood in front of the mirror in the back room of the pharmacy. 46 poisons. The transformation lasted 6 hours. His reflection stared back at him with golden eyes, green skin, webbed hands, a slender body. His cloak was soaked through, bare feet on the wet floor. He looked like a monster from swampy fairy tales. He felt like a man who had finally arrived at work. They set out at midnight. Daniel led the way, alone, unarmed. Minji and Hana took a parallel route through the garden. Their task was to neutralize the guards on the upper floors. Quietly, no killings. Minji knew the layout of the guard posts. Hana knew how to incapacitate a person in 3 seconds. Maddie and Ari were waiting at the gate with a cart. 3 dozen folders lay on the cart, copied formulas, the recipes for all the So House's key medications. Minji had retrieved them from the family archive 2 years before their escape. She'd kept them in a hiding place. She'd been waiting for the right moment. The moment had come. Daniel approached the main doors. 2 guards. He raised his hands. He showed his palms. Green, wet, unarmed. The guards exchanged glances. One stepped toward him. Daniel exhaled. A quiet exhale, almost imperceptible. A wisp of gas. Colorless, odorless. A mixture of a cyanogen derivative and a sleep-inducing agent based on modified histamine. The guard staggered. The second one did too. Both sank to the ground. Both fell asleep, alive. Their breathing was steady. Their pulses were stable. They would wake up in 4 hours with a headache and no memory of the last 10 minutes. Daniel opened the door and stepped inside. A long corridor. Dark wood, lamps on the walls, the scent of expensive wood and something else. Chemical. Laboratory-like. He walked down the corridor. Every security guard he encountered received a breath of air or a touch. He fell. He either fell asleep or froze in paralysis. Alive. Daniel left a trail of bodies in his wake and kept going. 3rd floor, 2nd, 1st, stairs down, the 1st underground level, storage rooms, hundreds of boxes of ingredients. Thousands of vials of prepared compounds, a fortune in glass vials. Daniel walked past without stopping. The second underground level, the laboratory. 2 alchemists at tables piled high with scrolls and flasks. They looked up. They saw him. One reached for a vial on the table. Daniel touched his hand first. A paralyzing touch. The alchemist froze with his hand outstretched. The second one backed up against the wall. Daniel exhaled in his direction. Gently, the alchemist slumped against the wall and fell asleep. The third underground level. 3 doors. The first one was unlocked. The second was bolted. The third was locked. Daniel touched the lock. He released an acidic mixture from his palm. The metal sizzled. It melted. A minute later, the lock was gone. Behind the door was a room. Small, stone walls, no windows, an oil lamp in the corner, the smell of mustiness, sickness, and something chemical, and a bed, narrow, wooden. A man lay on the bed, thin, gray-haired, with long, tangled hair. His gray skin was covered with a network of thin tubes. The tubes ran from his body to glass vessels on the wall. A dark liquid bubbled in the vessels. His blood, his secretions. His body was being pumped like a machine. 200 years. For 200 years, this man had lain here while substances were extracted from his body to create the 7th rot. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched. The man on the bed opened his eyes. Cloudy, gray, mad, his lips moved. His voice was quiet, hoarse, ruined by 2 centuries of silence. But the language he heard was English with a Boston accent. The man whispered 2 words. "You've come." His name was Elijah Cole, a biochemist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, class of 1823. Daniel corrected himself mentally. Not 1823. The year didn't matter. 200 years ago, he'd ended up here, just as Daniel had, through death, through poison, through a biochemical profile that matched, was waiting on the other side. Only Elijah didn't turn into a frog. He remained human, and Dom so found him before he found himself. Daniel worked quickly. The transformation lasted another 4 hours. He examined the test tubes. He licked the liquid in the vials. The analysis confirmed what he had suspected. Elijah's blood contained all 3 unknown components of decay. His body was producing them constantly, against his will. Domso had implanted a device in his spine, a bone needle impregnated with a compound that stimulated the production of certain proteins. Elijah was a living factory, raw material, an incubator. Daniel began disconnecting the tubes, carefully, one by one. He checked each one with his tongue. He disconnected each one only after making sure that doing so wouldn't kill the patient. Some tubes delivered nutrient solutions. He left those in place. Others drew blood and secretions. He removed those. Elijah lay there, watching him. His eyes were cloudy, but something appeared in them. Not clarity, direction. He looked at Daniel as if he were a dot in the fog, the only dot. He whispered again, in English. The words came in jagged fragments. Between them were pauses lasting tens of seconds. He said he had sent a signal, that for the last 20 years of his conscious life, he had been forming a molecular beacon in his blood, a protein sequence tuned to a specific biochemical profile, a person who would understand poisons, a person who could decipher what he had created. He said he hadn't wanted to create rot, that he'd been forced to, that for the first 10 years, he'd resisted. Then they showed him what they did to villages that didn't buy the medicine. And he broke and created what he was told to, the perfect instrument of obedience, a disease that doesn't kill, but subjugates. Then he realized what he had done. And he began to go mad, and in his madness, he found the only way out, to call upon the one who could fix it. Daniel listened. His hands were busy, removing the tubes, wiping his skin, checking his pulse. He was doing his job. The job for which he had been summoned across 2 worlds and 200 years, a needle in his spine. He found it by touch, thin, bone hard, embedded in the tissue. It couldn't simply be pulled out. It had fused with his nerves. A sudden pull would kill Elijah. Daniel closed his eyes. 46 poisons in his body, dozens of combinations, thousands of possible dosages. He ran through the options. He needed to dissolve the needle without damaging the nerves. Dissolve the bone inside a living spine. Acid is too aggressive. A neurotoxin would damage the nerves. A cytotoxin would destroy the surrounding tissue. No single toxin on its own would work. But together, a slow-acting mycotoxin, not for killing, for targeted dissolution, combined with an anti-inflammatory based on a wasp peptide. Combined with a neuroprotectant he'd developed for Hannah's father. 3 substances, 3 different mechanisms. One result, slow, safe dissolution of the bone needle from the inside. He dispensed the mixture through his fingertips. He applied it to Elijah's skin around the needle. Carefully, drop by drop. Elijah flinched.
He groaned. The process began. The needle started to soften. The tissue around it relaxed. The nerves were released one by one. An hour later, the needle was gone. The soft mass oozed out through the tiny incision Daniel had made with his fingernail.
Elijah lay there, breathing freely, for the first time in 200 years without a device in his spine. Daniel sat next to him on the floor. The transformation was coming to an end. The body began to tremble. The bones hummed. He could feel the form was slipping away. There were 20 minutes left. He took the last ampule out of his cloak, a complete antidote to the 7th rot, not a partial one, a complete one. He'd perfected it over the past week. The 3 unknown components were no longer unknown. He'd figured them out once he understood the nature of spiritual energy. Once he realized that this world's bioelectricity could be directed and redirected, that erased connections in the brain could be restored if one knew the exact frequency and the exact conductor molecule. The antidote wasn't for Elijah. Elijah wasn't infected. He was the source. The antidote was for everyone else, for the 7 villages, for Julia's 30 patients, for thousands of people across the continent. He placed the ampule on the table next to the bed. Next to it, he placed a scroll with the formula, the complete formula, every component, every dosage, every step of the production process. A formula that any competent alchemist could reproduce, for free, forever. Footsteps on the stairs. Joe J-Hyuk was coming down the steps, alone, without guards. The guards were upstairs, asleep or paralyzed. He entered the room. He saw Daniel. He saw Elijah without his tubes. He saw the ampule, the scroll. His expression hadn't changed. The smile remained. He said calmly that Daniel didn't understand what he was doing, that 3 provinces depended on the Sow House's medicines, that without the monopoly, the system would collapse, that the peasants wouldn't be able to prepare complex formulas on their own, that chaos would ensue, that people would die from incorrect dosages, from quacks, from ignorance. He said that a monopoly wasn't about greed, but a responsibility, that the House of Sow feeds an entire continent, that things would be worse without them. Daniel listened. His body was shrinking. His skin was tightening. His fingers were getting shorter. In 10 minutes, he'd be a frog again. He replied, his voice already hoarse and breaking. He said that J-Hyuk was right about one thing. People wouldn't be able to do it on their own. Right away. That's why every folder his people are now carrying out of the archive contains not only formulas, but also instructions. Simple, clear, with pictures drawn by a 15-year-old herbalist girl. Instructions that any village herbalist could understand. He said that tomorrow morning, 3 provinces would learn the recipes, all the recipes, for free, and that J-Hyuk might try to stop this. But the letter to the capital had already been sent, and that the imperial court would take a keen interest in the 7 villages with their obedient, free laborers. J-Hyuk was silent. His smile vanished for the first time since they'd met. He stared at the creature shrinking before his eyes, a creature that in a minute would become a tiny golden frog on the stone floor of the cellar, and which had just destroyed his life's work, not with a sword, not with an army, with recipes, with paper, with knowledge. Daniel shrank. He fell off the bed. He plopped onto the floor, small, wet, 10 centimeters. Minji appeared in the doorway. Behind her was Hana. Minji looked at her uncle. Jae-hyuk looked at his niece. She placed her folder on top of the stack on the table. The folder containing the So House's internal accounting records, with names, dates, amounts, evidence. Jae-hyuk sat down in the armchair, slowly, heavily, like a man who realized he had lost not just a battle, but an entire era. Hana picked Daniel up off the floor carefully, using a cloth. She placed him in the pot, that very pot, a clay one with a lid full of holes. The one in which Ari had brought him his first flies 10 months ago. They left the estate at dawn. The rain had stopped. The sky was gray and clear. The air smelled of wet earth and morning grasses. Maddie stood by the wagon with 3 dozen folders. Ari sat on the box and waited. Yuri held a list of the villages where the formulas needed to be delivered. Julia stood next to the wagon and counted the vials of the rottenness antidote. 12 vials. The first batch. For the worst cases. For those who had waited the longest. Elijah Cole lay on a bed in the basement. Alive, free of tubes and needles, insane, but alive. Daniel had left him a vial of a compound to restore his nervous system, the same one that had restored Father Hannah's fingers, only stronger, designed to treat 200 years' worth of damage. Elijah won't recover quickly. He might not recover fully, but he has a chance. His first in 200 years. Daniel sat in a little pot on Ari's lap. The wagon set off down the road to Lower Fog. 6 women sat around him. Each of them had come to him with her own pain. And for each of them, he had prepared not a great miracle, but a small, specific remedy. A syrup for insomnia that smelled like his mother's herbs. A concoction to restore mobility to the fingers. Drops for migraines. 7 recipes that neutralize 4 poisons. Tea for a weary woman who had spent 16 years burying her patients. A conversation as equals with the woman whose surname was hated by the entire continent. He didn't save the world. He didn't defeat evil. He didn't destroy the system with a single blow. He did something else. He provided recipes. He wrote down the formulas. He taught people, and now 3 provinces could treat themselves. Not for free, not magically, not perfectly, but on their own. Without a monopoly. Without the house of So. Without the little golden frog in a pot. Although the frog wasn't going anywhere just yet. It still needed 39 poisons to achieve a stable human form. And there was one more continent that needed to be broken down into molecules. But that was for later. Right now, the wagon was traveling along the wet road. Ari was humming softly. Hana was sharpening a knife. Maddie was reading a scroll. Yuri was keeping a list. Julia was counting vials. Minji was watching the road. And Daniel was sitting in a little pot. Small, golden, wet, poisonous. And for the first time in both of his lives, he knew exactly why he was here. He wasn't here to make a cure for a disease. He was here to make a cure for a human.